We will go ahead and call this meeting to order. Let me start with recognizing Ms. Davis to call the first item of business.
Okay. Good morning. We'll call roll. Mr. Vasquez,
Present.
Mr. Schaefer,
Present.
Mr. Gaines,
Present.
Ms. Cohen,
Present.
Ms. Yee.
Here.
We have a quorum present. We will go ahead and get started. The first order of business is we're going to have the Pledge of Allegiance, and I am honored to bring up the new president of the CAA, president here, Don Gayko, to come up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please rise. Join me in pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Davis, if you would call the first item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first item is D2, Tax Program Non-Appearance Matters, Consent, Property Tax Matters. Item D2A is a petition for the reassessment of unitary value for Univer Canada L. Limited. This is a constitutional function of the board, and we got that right this time, Ms. Yee. Note that the the controller is present and will be participating. Contribution disclosure forms are not required for these items. Mr. Harris, the acting chief of State Assessed Properties Division, is here to present this item. Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Good morning, Chairman Vasquez and members of the board. I'm Mike Harris, Acting Chief of the State Assessed Properties Division. Before you for your consideration and adoption is a petition for reassessment of private railroad car tax. Staff and petitioner are in agreement with the recommendation, and I ask for your adoption.
Members, do we have any questions or comments? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the staff recommendation.
So move.
It's been moved by our controller, Ms. Yee. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by our vice chair. Can we have a roll call?
Mr. Vasquez,
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer,
Yes.
Mr. Gaines,
Yes.
Ms. Cohen,
Aye.
Controller Yee.
Aye.
That's unanimous by those present. If we can go on to the next item, Ms. Davis.
Our next item is E3, Tax Program Non-Appearance Matters Adjudicatory, Legal Appeals Property Tax Matters, Petitions for Reassessment of Unitary Value. Hearing this item is also a constitutional function of the board, and the controller is present and will participate. Contribution disclosure forms are required for this item, and they were received for this item on January 24th. There were no disqualifying contributions reported. Appeals Attorney Ms. Himmelwitz is present and will present this item.
Welcome.
Hi, my name is Julie Himmelwitz. I'm an attorney with BOE Legal. Members of the board, I've prepared a written decision memorializing your decision from December in this matter, and I ask for your adoption.
Any questions from the members, comments? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the staff recommendation.
So moved.
It's been moved by our controller, Yee. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by our vice chair. Can we have a roll call vote?
Mr. Vasquez,
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer,
Yes.
Mr. Gaines,
Aye.
Ms. Cohen,
Aye.
Controller Yee.
Aye.
So that's unanimous by those present. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Davis, we can go on to the next item.
Our next item is item F3, Other Tax Program Non-Appearance Matters, Property Tax Matters. These items do not require contribution disclosure forms. Hearing these two items is also a constitutional function of the board. Controller Yee is present and will be participating. These items may be taken separately or in one vote. Mr. Harris is back to present the items.
Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Vasquez and members of the board, again, I'm Mike Harris, Acting Chief of the State Assessed Properties Division. Before you are 4 audit findings, one landscape assessment, and a 2019 role change. I ask for your adoption of these items.
Any comments or questions from the members?
Is there any detail
Yes.
that you can share with us specific to the recommendations that you're making today?
I'm sorry?
I said, are there any details that you can share with us to the recommendations? that you're-
No.
We good?
Yes.
I would like to entertain a motion to approve staff recommendation.
So moved.
It's been moved by
Second.
Member Gaines, second by our controller. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Mr. Vasquez?
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer?
Yes.
Mr. Gaines?
Aye.
Ms. Cohen?
Aye.
Controller Yi?
Aye.
So that's unanimous by those present. If we can move on to the next item, Ms. Davis?
Our next item is I-1, Other Chief Counsel Matters, Organization of the Board, and the Election of the Chair and Vice Chair. These items may be taken separately or together. Mr. Nanjo is prepared to come forward with this item.
Good
Welcome.
morning, Chairman Vasquez, members of the board. This item was placed on the agenda, as you know, pursuant to the policy. There was a brief discussion about the policy that the board adopted in January and February of 2019 on the rotation of the chair. That brief discussion in December confirmed that the board was operating on that policy and no changes have been made to it. So consequently, as I reported in December, by operation of that policy, yourself, Mr. Vasquez, became chairman as of beginning of January, and Mr. Schaefer became vice chair. At this point, I mentioned that it was traditional for lack of a better term, if the board so desired to have a ceremonial vote in January, confirming the chair and vice chair. This is merely a placeholder for the opportunity to do so if the board so wishes. It is not necessary, it would be a ceremonial vote.
What is the wish? Oh, yes, Ms. Cohen.
I'd like to speak to that
Yes.
and a couple things, just a motion for the organization of the board. Consistent with the board's governance policy, which requires an election of the board chair and vice chair in January of each year, I'd like to make a motion to reconfirm for this year, 2020, the vote of the board taken at our January 29th meeting of 2019. Which established an annual rotation of the board chair and vice chair in order of the Board of Equalization District. And there's some background references that I'd like to read into the record. This is the governance policy and minutes of January 29th of 2019, the board meeting. The board governance policy adopted at the February 26, 2019 board meeting, page 9, section 7, role and powers of the board. The board shall do all of the following: conduct elections of the board chair and vice chair in January of each year. The role of the board chair and vice chair: it's a rotation of the board chair and the vice chair. The board chair and vice chair shall serve one-year term from January to December, and each position will rotate on an annual basis in order of equalization districts. Also want to highlight the minutes of January 29th, the 2019 board meeting, under Chief Counsel Matters and other Chief Counsel Matters, the organization of the board. Upon motion of Mr. Gaines, seconded by Ms. Cohen, and unanimously carried, Mr. Gaines, Ms. Cohen, Mr. Vasquez, Mr. Schaefer, and Ms. Yee voting yes, the board chooses a rotation policy of one-year term that began each January meeting, beginning with District 2 as chair and District 3 as vice chair, effective immediately, rotating by district member each January thereafter. So again, I would like to suggest a motion for the organization of the board, consistent with the board's governance policy, which requires an election of the board chair and vice chair in January of each year. I'd like to make a motion to reconfirm for this year of 2020, the vote of the board taken at our January 29th, 2019 board meeting, which establishes an annual rotation of the board chair and vice chair in order of equalization districts. Thank you.
So is that a motion? You want?
Yes, it's a motion for organization of the board.
Okay.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Of clarification, and Member Yee, maybe you could help, because I'm just looking for clarity in terms of the governance policy that we voted for. And some language says that there would just be an automatic rotation from one board member to another based on district. But there also seems to be some language within that document that doesn't make it completely clear as to whether there should be a vote or not on each of these rotations. So I'm just looking for clarity in terms of what is the intent of the document, and then how do we move forward in the future?
Mr. Scholler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can speak a little historically about it, but it's really the prerogative of the board. But in the past, there have been, I guess, prior arrangements leading up to the chair change every year, where the rotation would be essentially automatic, rotational by district. And then subsequent years, we've actually had active elections of chair and vice chair. So it really disregarded the prior rotational policy by district.
Okay.
So it's really up to the board. I will note that, and I guess I will ask Mr. Nanjo to go back and take a look, but the governance policy that Ms. Cohn just read, and I get in the minutes reflected from the January 20th, 2019 meeting, I just want to be sure that and even though that predated the adoption of the governance policy, I just want to be sure that everything kind of syncs up in terms of, what our process is. So whichever way this board chooses to determine the chair and vice chair, that we're kind of consistent throughout how we refer to it. Because a motion was made in the January 29th meeting that spoke about rotation and by districts, and that's not exactly reflected in the governance policy. And would probably, and the general provision of the governance policy suggests that there could be other options for electing a
Yes,
chair.
so
and vice chair.
I can address that. I was asked to look into that. So in January, you passed the the rotation policy,
Right.
which basically speaks to an automatic transfer of the chair. Again, as I've mentioned before, this is a policy of the board. It can be changed at any time by a majority vote of the board. But very clearly, that policy was an automatic rotation. What happened was, if you remember correctly, between the January and February meeting, there was some edits made to the governor's policy that you, Controller Yee, suggested.
Yes.
I would apologize on my behalf. Inadvertently, I did not see, we changed the language in the election of the chair and vice chair section, which is subsequent to the portion that was read by Ms. Cohen, to make it consistent with the rotation policy that the board passed. I did not see that provision that Ms. Cohen read in the provision of the governor's policy, so it does create an ambiguity in that respect. But the way I interpret that, given the governor's policy, which was clearly discussed, and the intent of the rotation policy, which existed before the governor's policy was passed, was that there would be an automatic rotation. I view that as, again, it's within the powers of the board to have an election. Candidly, they can have an election at any time, but the governor's policy suggests ones that take place in January. To make that consistent with the rotation policy that was approved by the board, I interpret that as a ceremonial vote.
Okay.
So at this point, based on my opinion, you can either have the vote or not have the vote. Ms. Cohen did make a motion, so you have a motion. I don't know if I heard a second, but it's up to you, Chair, on how you want to proceed.
Is there a second on that motion?
I'd like to ask just more questions. So
Sure.
if the maker of the motion could just clarify, are we changing our governance policy to a vote for each rotation each year? Or is there a natural rotation that occurs that the board could always change, right? In the event that there was an issue or a problem, 3 votes could make a change.
Yeah.
But, so I'm just, if you could just clarify.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Gaines.
Great.
Good morning, everyone. So the motion, actually, I'll read it again. It's just consistent with the governance policy that requires an election of the board chair and vice chair in January of each year. I'm just reaffirming that.
Okay.
It does not, I'm not saying that it has to be excuse me, the motion does say that the chair and vice chair in order of equalization districts. That is my motion.
Yes, okay. Would it require a vote? Is the motion stating that it would require a vote each year, or?
Or that it's an automatic
Based
decision?
based on the motion, I'm not hearing anything that changes the governance policy.
That's correct. It's not
Okay.
changing
Yeah,
anything.
I
Okay.
believe what, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Member Cohen, but I believe what Member Cohen is suggesting is to be consistent with the provision of the governor's policy that's there. She's just saying, let's just have a vote and confirm that, so.
That is correct. So in Controller Yee's remarks, remember, she talked a little bit about the discrepancy, that our vote is not quite in sync with something that we have spelled out in the governance policy. The motion that I'm making is trying to tie it up and to clean it up, just to tighten it up a little bit more, saying that we will continue to vote on an annual basis. So January of next year, we will have another vote.
Okay.
I do want to go on record, I disagree that it's ceremonial. I don't believe that anything that we do as constitutional officers is ceremonial, and that we do have a constitutional responsibility.
Okay.
Um, So,
Okay, just a question on that. Would that allow a rotational?
yes, sir.
A rotational change without a vote? So would that be another option?
A rotational change, well, according to the motion that I'm making, yes, we will have to have another vote if we're going to have a rotational change that is
Okay.
outside of the district,
Okay.
outside of the district sequential order.
If
that
if I
makes
can
sense.
weigh in here, Member Cohen's motion is just for this year. As for,
Correct.
she's suggesting that we do this also next year, but I'm not hearing a requested change to the rotation policy, which would be necessary for it to not be automatic anymore.
Mr. Nanjo is correct.
Okay.
So if this body wants to make any changes, we have the purview to do it. We can do it anytime this year.
Okay.
So
So I'm
member,
not taking away any
All right.
flexibility. I think that's what maybe what you're interested in. There's no flexibility. I'm just clearly stating for the record the motion.
Okay. Very well.
Okay,
Great. I'll second that motion.
thank you.
All right, so let's call, there's no other questions or comments? We'll take a vote.
Mr. Vasquez?
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer?
Nay.
Mr. Gaines?
Aye.
Ms. Cohen?
Aye.
Controller Yee?
Aye.
All right, so that actually goes down as a 4-1.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Davis?
Okay, we will now move on to the administrative session. The first item is the administrative consent agenda. Item J1 is the approval of the board meeting minutes for December 16th, 2019, and December 17th, 2019. These items may be taken individually or together.
Is there any comments or questions about the minutes? We're looking at December 6th and the 17th.
I would just like to clarify that I was not at the informational hearing. So the minutes for that portion.
Is it missing your, I'm saying?
So I did not attend the informational hearing.
Oh, okay.
So I just want the record to reflect
To
that.
reflect that?
Yeah.
So noted. Any other changes or comments to the minutes?
I have none.
None? Seeing none, then I'd like to entertain a motion to adopt the minutes with the one correction made by our member Gaines.
Second.
It's been moved, I guess, by the chair and second by Mr. Gaines. Can we have a roll call vote?
Mr. Vasquez?
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer?
Yes.
Mr. Gaines?
Yes.
Ms. Cohen?
Aye.
Controller Yee?
Aye.
So that's unanimous by those present. Ms. Davis, if we can move on to the next item.
Our next item in the administrative session is item K1, the Executive Director's Report. There are five items within the Executive Director's Report. Ms. Fleming will introduce each item, and she's coming right now. Thank you, Ms. Fleming.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Happy Tuesday, members. Chairman Vasquez and honorable members, I am Brenda Fleming, Executive Director. Today's report, members, will include the updates to the Operational Priorities Dashboard, focusing on those items with substantive updates for activity since last month's report. An update also on the remaining 2 of the 4 statewide informational hearings. I'll provide a brief update on the proposed spring finance letter, which requests funding for operating expenses and equipment. We have the pleasure, at about 11 o'clock today, we'll have the pleasure of a guest speaker, Mr. Vivek Viswanathan, the Chief Deputy Director from the Department of Finance. Vivek will join us to present an overview of the Governor's 2020-2021 budget. And we'll have Ms. Lisa Thompson, our taxpayer rights advocate, who will provide an update on the Mountain Ranch properties damaged by the 2015 Butte fire. And that item was discussed at the August 2019 board meeting. Members, the dashboard, a little bit of a change. The dashboard is being updated to include the 2020 priorities, some of which are carryover from the 2019 year. Again, the dashboard draws attention to operational priorities that are outside the normal daily workload or are items of particular interest to the board. The format has been revised so that the items are listed under the managers that are responsible for those areas. Going forward, this will allow the managers to report on their items. As was done last year, we'll report on the items with substantive updates or activity since last month's report. If you would allow me, members, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Ms. Cohen and her leadership as the board's chair in 2019, and the many, many suggestions and ideas that Ms. Cohen offered to ensure transparency and access to BOE's tax program information for all interested stakeholders. Ms. Cohen's suggestions served as the basis for many of the recurring management reports and training topics covered in 2019. To name a few of the topics, surveys, if you recall, we walked through the calendar of 2019, surveys, letters to the assessors, assessors' handbooks, calamities and disaster relief efforts, welfare exemptions, property tax forms, legal opinions, and so many more. These topics, members, are important to the property tax field, and we hope that the training and the recurring management reports were helpful to all stakeholders. Ms. Cohen, thank you for your support of the BOE's modernization goals, for all your contributions to the 2019 accomplishments, and your commitment to the board's mission, which is to serve the public through fair, effective, and efficient tax administration. So again, thank you for all that we were able to accomplish in 2019.
Thank you.
It was amazing. Members, now I'll continue.
Ms. Fleming, if I could
Yes.
just interrupt real quick.
Sorry.
I know Ms. Yvette Stowers has to leave early, but I think she has a comment before she steps
Yes,
up.
thank you, Chairman. I also want to thank Ms. Coleman for her excellent service over the past year. She came on as a new member and made some great changes to how we conduct our business. It's always nice to have that fresh, clean approach to things. We sometimes get hung up on doing business as usual. So, but you, all four of you guys came forward with new ideas and suggestions. And I think because of that, the BOE is a better organization. So thank you very much. Thank you. And I note the Controller Yee has left the room, and I too have a conflicting meeting that I'm going to have to leave at 10:30 as well. But thank you all.
Thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, members. Item number one, if we can draw your attention to item number one, is the BOE strategic plan. The agency's strategic plan for 2020-2025 was presented at the November board meeting, if you recall. The plan focuses on rebuilding, revitalizing, and modernizing our agency to position us for the ongoing and future property tax needs. The forms and publication staff are finalizing the pamphlet to make it web-ready to post on the BOE website. Hard copies, of course, will also be available. And we're starting now to drill down on the details of the implementation plan. And of course, we'll keep you posted. Item two, members, the BOE annual report for 2018-2019. Staff is finalizing the draft and publication layout for review. Our target for publication of this material is the first quarter of 2020, and staff are making good progress. If I can draw your attention to item number three, which is the taxpayers' rights advocates. The TRA's annual report for 2018-2019 will be published in February of 2020. The annual Taxpayers' Bill of Rights hearing is proposed for the August board meeting. Ms. Thompson will provide updates on her TRA work activity shortly in a subsequent agenda item. Item number four, statewide informational hearings. The BOE members have successfully completed 2 of the 4 planned statewide informational hearings. The remaining 2 hearings are tentatively scheduled. Member Gaines is scheduled for April 29th, 2020 in the Sacramento area here at 450 N Street. Chairman Vasquez for District 3 is tentatively planned for the second quarter of 2020 in the Santa Monica area. Staff will continue, members, to work with you to assist with all of the preparations. Item 5, which is the office relocation project. All members have been relocated into the downtown offices, so we've just about finalized that project. There's some minor tenant improvements that are occurring. We're now focusing members on the BOE headquarters, which will be relocated from 450 N Street to Natomas, 160 Promenade in Natomas. Floor plans are being finalized. We are currently working with DGS and CDTFA to revise the anticipated completion date. Drawing your attention, members, to item 6, which is the ACA 2. No change on this bill. It's currently assigned to the Assembly Rev and Tax Committee. Mr. Durham and his ledge staff will continue to track. Item number 7, AB 576 by Nazarian, was heard by the Assembly Appropriations Committee on January 23, 2020. Mr. Durham will speak to this in his upcoming agenda item. Number 8, members, for HR delegation. If you recall, we met with the representatives from the State Personnel Board, CalHR, and CDTFA in December to discuss the next steps and actions needed for restored delegation. Since then, CalHR has provided data regarding their areas of concern, which will be addressed. Mostly there's management training, additional management training that we'll have to go through, and some recurring reports that will document our progress and our compliance. Additionally, CalHR agreed to work with us to streamline the length of time for straight refill recruitments to be processed, and hopefully that'll help also accelerate this process. The fact that SBB and CalHR are actively engaged with us is a really, really promising sign. CDTFA's HR Bureau has recently developed and trained the CDTFA's management on the updated hiring processes. They will train BOE management next. The good news, members, is that the State Personnel Board stated that if/when CDTFA and CalHR confirm the hiring processes are being consistently and adequately followed, then BOE can then appear before the State Personnel Board to report on the corrective actions that we've accomplished and show consistency with our compliance with the HR processes and policies. My goal is to be prepared with all the documentation that's needed, to be prepared to appear before the State Personnel Board this calendar year. Ideally, I'm optimistic, third quarter of this year, but we'll see how the training and our progress reports with CalHR occur. I'm hopeful that this timeline provides a satisfactory level of data to justify the restored delegation. Item number 9, members, regarding recruitments. The BOE currently has 192, a little bit more than 192 budgeted positions, including member offices. We currently have 54 vacancies, 44 agency vacancies, and 10 vacancies in the member offices. Approximately 63% of the agency's 44 vacancies are in active recruitment. Since last month, a couple of bullet points for you. Since last month, 3 positions advertised, 20 with applications being reviewed or interviews are occurring, and we have been in lots of interviews these days. 2 recruitments with identified start dates, 3 with a tentative offer. The remaining 16 are in review or are being prepared for advertising. There are 10 board member vacancies with 4 in active recruitment. Here's a little bit of the revision of the format, as again organized under the manager's areas. So for property tax, we'll focus on the state assessed property valuation process. Staff is currently working on the 2020 lien date capitalization rate study and preparing for the upcoming appraisal season. Property statements are due on March 2nd, 2020. State assessees will be given the opportunity to make presentations to the board on the cap rates and other factors affecting their values at the February and April board meetings. State assessee unitary values will be set at the May board meeting. Community Land Trust, Senate Bill 196. This legislation, as you know, will become effective on January 1, 2020. The law that was passed included 2 changes to the original bill. As a result, staff will go back to the interested parties process to develop language for guidance. All participants agree on the process and the path forward. The process is anticipated to run into the second quarter of this year, this calendar year. Once the interested parties process is complete, guidance on the appraisal and assessment of properties built on the CLT land will be issued in the form of a letter to assessors. Staff is currently developing language, drafting language for guidance on the valuation of property and exemption of CLT property. Item 3, county assessed certificated aircraft, Senate Bill 791. The legislation became effective upon chaptering and will be operative for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. The County Assessed Properties Division continues to work on the needed permanent regulations, guidance in the form of assessors' handbooks and letters to assessors. Emergency regulations and forms were adopted by the board at the November meeting, if you recall. The next step will be for staff to start the interested parties process to draft permanent regulations to replace the temporary emergency regulations. And our property tax staff will work closely with legal. Staff will also use the interested parties process to update the assessor's handbooks, 570, which is the assessment of general aircraft. And this project's anticipated right now to be about 2 years. Item 4, split roll. There are currently, I'm sorry.
I beg your pardon. Ms. Fleming, are there uncertificated aircraft? I'm not, why are some certificated and some not?
So good question, sir, and if I may put a bookmark on that, and then when Mr. Young comes up for his presentation, I can make sure that he provides that information.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Split roll, there are currently, as you know, 2 proposed initiatives. Staff is following the changes and movement of the various initiatives. BOE is gathering, continues to gather information on what the changes would require, depending on what version of it moves forward. We're determining what the workload for that initiative would require. And we continue to stay in communication with the assessors as we prepare. Just an update on some of the legal items. The priorities listed below for this item are addressed by the legal department. So we've had some recent legislation that requires some regulation changes. So rules for tax appeals, regulatory updates, legal staff's working to update the rules for tax appeals, and those regulations to reflect the BOE 2.0 appeals and process and administrative changes. The updates are anticipated to be completed by mid-2020. Form 700 reporting requirements for BOE employees, that's our Form 700 for FPPC. We need to update the disclosure categories for that. Legal staff is currently drafting updates to the regulations that address employees' reporting responsibilities of conflict of interest, et cetera, in the org structure. The next category is board proceedings, similarly working in conjunction with legal to update affected forms and publications. They're looking at reference manuals, publication and forms related to appeals to reflect the statutory changes. And then lastly, members, in your report, there's just a highlight of some of the upcoming meetings just for your general reference. So members, that concludes this month's report on the operational priorities. Moving forward, as I noted before, in the statewide informational hearings, I've noted it earlier that you've got an April 29th, 2020 meeting and then a second quarter meeting subsequently following that. Just a quick update for you on the spring finance letters. I think I reported in November or December, we were preparing a spring finance letter for the operating expenses and equipment. That is a process that allows us to present a budget change proposal to ask for additional funding that would help us with some of the basic operations regarding refreshing technology. As recent as this week, we've had a range of conversations with representatives of the Department of Finance and also with CDTFA. And so in lieu of going through the legislative process and the budget hearing process, we have an opportunity to work with those agencies to for some alternative funding sources. I'll be happy to circle back with you to provide that detail, but to the extent that we can use this process, which we use something very similar in a prior budget cycle, it does give us a more expedited route to get the funding that we would need so that we would still be able to meet our objectives. Out of respect for the staff and they're working through the details and fleshing out some of the arrangements, I can circle back with you with those details. But we're optimistic, and I think it's a better approach in the long run. We will have Mr. Viswanathan from the Department of Finance that will join us again around 11, so I'll hold on the comments for him at this point. And then if you, with your permission, members, I'll switch to Ms. Lisa Thompson that can come forward and give you an update on the Mountain Ranch properties. And that concludes this month's report, and I'll come back when Mr. Viswanathan arrives. Lisa?
Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Vasquez and honorable board members. I'm Lisa Thompson, Chief of the Taxpayer Rights Advocate Office, and I'm here to provide you with an update on the status of the Mountain Ranch properties damaged by the 2015 Butte fire in Calaveras County that was discussed at the August 27, 2019 Taxpayer Bill of Rights hearing. Prior to the Bill of Rights hearing, the 3 taxpayers who spoke at the Bill of Rights hearing had contacted the Taxpayer Rights Advocate Office with concerns about assessments on their properties following the Butte fire that occurred in September 2015 in Calaveras County and large property tax increases that they had experienced. The taxpayers also contacted Board Member Gaines's office after the Taxpayer Rights Advocate Office had started their work on their issue. The Taxpayer Rights Advocate Office finished its work and has sent a letter to the taxpayers on January 8, 2020, providing the results of our review. As part of our review, we conducted an extensive analysis to ensure that the taxpayers were treated fairly in accordance with property tax law. As part of that review, we analyzed assessed values from 2014 through 2019 and reviewed notices sent by the Assessor's Office to the taxpayers for disaster relief, as well as for value increases to ensure that they contain the required items. Our analysis found that there were increases in assessed values on their properties beyond 2% from one year to the next, but that the increases complied with property tax law because property was assessed under Proposition 13 factored base year value at its market value under decline in value status, or that there was new construction on the property. Our analysis determined that the properties were not overassessed as the taxpayers had thought. Our letter to the taxpayers provided information on how properties are assessed in California and the limitations of Proposition 13, and identified the assessed value increases or decreases for their properties from 2014 through 2019, the type of assessments on their properties, and the reason for the assessed value changes. The letter explained why increases in assessed values of greater than 2% from one year to the next on some of the properties were acceptable under property tax law, and why one property increased beyond 2% when another did not, due to the type of assessment on the property. Basically, increases in assessed value beyond 2% is not prohibited when property is assessed at market value under a decline in value status, or what some refer to as Proposition 8. The 2% limitation only applies when a property is assessed at its factored base year value. Under Proposition 13, properties are reassessed at its market value based on a number of triggers, such as a transfer of the property, no recent purchase, or completion of new construction. This reassessment to current market value is called the base year value of the property. In the years following the establishment of the base year value, the increases in the base year are limited to no more than 2% based on an inflation factor. And this is referred to as the factored base year value of that product. The inflation factor is based on the California Consumer Price Index, and this is published by the Board of Equalization with a 2% limit according to the law. Each year, the property must be assessed at the lower of factored base year value or market value as required by Revenue and Taxation Code Section 51 in California. This becomes important when the property has undergone a decline in value, such that its market value falls below its factored base year value. In that case, the assessor must recognize that decline. And since the property must be assessed at the lower of the factored base year value or market value, the current market value becomes the property's assessed value as a temporary reduction until the factored base year value is once again the lower of the two values. So in California, the property's factored base year value sets the ceiling on what the assessor can assess the property at for property tax purposes. When a property is assessed under this decline in value status at its market value, there is no percentage limit on the increases in assessed value. So we, in our letter, explained that to taxpayers, And in addition to that, for each property examined, the Taxpayer Rights Advocate Office calculated the factored base year value of each of the properties to ensure that the assessor did not assess it higher than its factored base year value. Our calculations were included in part of the exhibit to our letter that was provided to the taxpayers, and in no case was the property assessed above its factored base year value. Our letter also explained when improvements are rebuilt, that if additional square footage is added, which was the case on one of the properties, then that portion is treated as new construction, and the value is set to market value for that portion of added square footage as of the date of completion. Additionally, because the fire occurred shortly after California's housing market began to improve following the Great Recession, we presented information as part of an exhibit to show that it wasn't just the fire itself that caused the value increases, that it was just a matter of timing. In our second exhibit to the letter, we described improvements in the California housing market as indicated by the Legislative Analyst's Office in a May 5th, 2014 report entitled Property Tax Reductions to Diminish as Housing Market Improves. We also identified data collected by the State Board of Equalization and published in its budgets and workload reports to show increases in market value due to reductions in properties assessed at a factored base year value, at properties assessed under its factored base year value under a decline in value Proposition 8 status. As part of the information in that exhibit, we identified assessed values of the properties prior to the fire from 2008 through 2015, and discussed how the assessed values of their properties were showing that there were increases prior to the fire. Our letter to the taxpayers extended the offer for them to contact our office if they had any questions and on the analysis of our letter or exhibits. Each of the 3 taxpayers were sent separate copies of the letter with the 2 exhibits, and the Calaveras County Assessor Leslie Davis was also provided a copy of that letter. As part of the analysis, it required coordination with the Calaveras County Assessor's Office in providing information to us, and we appreciate their cooperation in providing that to us during the course of our review. Unless there are any questions, this concludes my update.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's one from Mr. Gaines.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much, Ms. Thompson, for going through all this process. And it's been a long one, but I wanted to make sure that we were examining a broad enough swath of appraisal years. So I appreciate you going back to 2008 through 15, I think is 2015.
Yes, prior to the fire, so we looked at
So it could show
earlier, 10 years ago.
what was happening with property values, a decline during the recession, and then it slowly increasing after the recession. And it seems like there were a lot of variables going on. So you had, I think in one structure, there was new construction. So you had increased taxes as a result of new construction. You had Prop 8, where you were bringing values back up as the market was increasing in value back to its original value. And so I just appreciate the look at it. And one thing I am concerned about in my rural counties is that with the fire risk, we're finding that it's very difficult for homeowners to buy insurance. And the wildfire exposure is also scaring some people in the marketplace, and we're seeing declining values now as a result of wildfire exposure. I've read a couple of articles in El Dorado County, for instance, just read one yesterday. And so I guess my question would be, are the assessors, and maybe Don could help out with this, Mr. Gakel, but it'd be nice to get to know, as that market changes, are the county assessors taking a look at changing market conditions as a result of wildfire? Because I don't see that issue going away for years. and yet you may be paying, property taxes on a property that's not worth what it was 2 or 3 years ago.
We have Mr. Gago coming up.
Yes, well, is this on?
It's on.
Certainly, assessors would be reviewing properties for declining values. Certainly in those fire areas, I'm sure those assessors are acutely aware of the market conditions in their area. Over time, market values of properties that transfer in those areas will also, establish
Reflect that.
market values
Yes, okay.
in that area. So, yes, they're acutely aware of them. They would be watching market values and sales in those areas, certainly of damaged properties and repaired properties, and would be looking at that. Yes,
Okay, good.
that
Now,
would be part of the mix.
so under a Prop 8 scenario, would a Prop 8 scenario apply to a decline in value in a wildfire area? Let's say I still own the home, but the appraised value of the home has declined as a result of the perceived fire exposure and lack of availability of homeowners insurance.
Certainly, yes. That
Okay.
would be something that we'd take a look at. Whether that data is really out there yet or not is another matter. That's kind of a developing an issue. Insurance companies are kind of part of that mix, and we'll see over time what impact that has on market values in the area.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
I had a
Yes, Mr. Vice Chair Schaefer.
Mr. Gayko, normally there's a limitations period that people can file some kind of complaint or review, because normally the assessor's office wouldn't know about things that affect a particular home. But here, you know about it because it's the whole neighborhood, it's I'd like to know if you have any little flexibility if somebody comes to you with a complaint that they've missed some 30-day deadline to do something, or 90-day deadline, whatever the deadline is. We might even go as far as those we haven't heard from. If there's 500 property owners, you've only heard from 415 of them, send a little form letter out letting them know that we'd like to hear from you, whether you are content or not content. I'm speaking for the homeowners that may not have an attorney or somebody really intelligent as to what's going on, that may not know that there's some deadlines out there, and they may be deemed to have supped on it, and that's not really the case. They're just not aware. Maybe they don't have that good rapport with their neighbors that are all talking with each other, which we hope would be the case.
Well, there are a number of issues. Certainly, on disaster relief claims, homeowners have a year after the event to file a claim. There are also the issue of declining values, and certainly I'm sure that, again, the local assessors are looking at those issues in the areas where they know that there is a larger problem. I assume you're talking about properties that are occupied but may be affected by fire damage in their area.
And maybe unoccupied that have high values and maybe owned by an out-of-town or even an out-of-state owner. We own a property in Catonsville, Maryland, and we're not there, and there's lots of things going on we may not be knowing about, and there should be some reason for us to be protesting something, but, since I am not aware of the news there like I am here, we're at a disadvantage, yet we're still paying the taxes.
Well, I'm sure that if there is a large-scale issue in an area, the assessors in that area would be looking at it, should be looking at it if they know that there is
Yes.
a widespread issue. Certainly, if they've addressed that on a year-to-year basis, it is kind of incumbent on the property owner to question that if they if they have a question, they could certainly appeal the values.
And it's incumbent upon the assessor to sua sponte, take a look at it on behalf of the property
Well,
owner.
absolutely, and I'm sure in those areas where the assessors know that there is an issue going on, they would be more than happy to do that.
Sure.
But certainly on a broader scale within a county or anywhere, if there's a known decline in values, the assessors will be looking at that. Absent that, certainly if homeowners are dissatisfied with their value or think there's been a decline in value, they can certainly contact the assessor's office and request a review of that.
Sure.
And they certainly have the option of also filing an appeal in that year if they feel that they're overassessed.
I just wanted to
Sure.
add something on disaster relief. So there are, for certain disasters, there is a claim filing period, but in many cases, the assessor has the ability, based on if their county has approved that, is to actually grant disaster relief to a person, or in large scale cases such as the Butte fire in Calaveras County, as well as the fire that was experienced in Butte County, is the assessor can actually proactively grant disaster relief without requiring the actual homeowners to file a claim. So that has been done.
That's good news. I'm
Yes,
glad to
so
hear
that was done by the Calaveras County Assessor's Office, actually, for the areas that were affected by that fire. There were, I don't know, a little over 2,000 properties affected, so they were not required to file a claim
Okay,
to
I
grant
want
their
to
disaster
commend
relief.
those assessors
Yeah.
for looking out after their charges.
Yes.
Yeah, Member Schaefer, I should say, that's true in our county as well. We can, we had an ordinance passed where we can grant disaster relief if we know of the damage without having a application filed.
We're not dealing in adversary proceedings as much as we're dealing with fair and equitable.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assessor Gagel.
Thank you.
We're back on with Ms. Fleming.
That is correct. So I've just been informed, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mr. Gakel, and members, our guest, Mr. Vivek Viswanathan. I hope I don't mispronounce his name. I call him Vivek. He's a friend of the BOE and the state of California. He's the Chief Deputy for the Department of Finance. So if you don't mind, I'd like to extend the invitation for Vivek to join us at the
Sure, come on
table,
up.
and he will provide an update and an overview of the governor's proposed budget for 2020, 2021. Hello.
Welcome, and we're going to have you pronounce your name correctly.
Yes. Pull it every single time. I totally know how to spell it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my name is Vivek Viswanathan. And,
Viswanath.
Viswanathan.
Viswanath, okay.
Yes. Yes. And thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As you know, the governor put out his January budget proposal about 2 weeks ago. So I thought I'd spend just about 5 or 6 minutes running through the major highlights, and then happy to take questions about any aspect of it, both what I mentioned as well as other aspects of the budget that the governor is proposing.
Sure.
Yes. So the budget that the governor put out in January basically projects a spending plan of overall $222.2 billion, of which $153 billion approximately would be from the state's general fund. The budget that the governor proposed is balanced and also projects operating surpluses, not only in the coming year, but in each of the next 3 years following that, meaning that in each of those years, the revenues and transfers that we are expecting exceed the expenditures that we're projecting for those years. That being said, the Department of Finance and the administration is forecasting slowing growth based on a number of global risks to the economic forecast. And so we do see in the revenue picture that in each year over the next 4 years, we're expecting slower percentage year-over-year revenue growth than we are the year before that. In addition, there are a number of federal actions where right now the picture is uncertain in terms of any reimbursements or other federal government policies that we'd want to watch out for in thinking about our projections over the next several years. So in addition to the balanced budget, We are projecting reserves at the end of the budget year of approximately $21 billion. For the current year that we're in right now, we're projecting to end the year with $19 billion in reserves. So this would be on top of that. And the main difference is an additional deposit into the budget stabilization account known as the rainy day fund. And so we're expecting that account will now be $18 billion of the overall $21 billion. The other $3 billion is accounted for a special fund for economic uncertainties, which would be at $1.6 billion. That's basically the state's checking account and where we draw on first when there is an emergency or other type of action like that. In addition, we have about $500 million in the PSSSA, which is a new account created by Proposition 2. That's the Public School System Stabilization Account, which is basically a reserve fund for schools. And then finally, we have $900 million in the safety net reserve. This is for when, if and when a recession happens. Oftentimes, it's Medi-Cal and CalWorks that bear the brunt of the cuts, even though caseload for those programs actually tends to go up in a recession as incomes go down. And so this account is at $900 million, which is unchanged from the current year. And then the last 2 points I'll make just on the budget structure are, number one, in the Budget Act that the legislature enacted last year, the legislation included a number of supplemental pension payments for our unfunded liabilities. So these are over and above the payments that the state was required to make. But the governor and the legislature recognized that we do have these unfunded liabilities that are significant, and we want to, when we have a surplus, pay some of them down. And so under that plan, for the supplemental payments to Calstrs specifically, we had budgeted $2.5 billion in the budget year, as well as $500 million over the next 3 years. And then this budget that the governor proposed in January proposes taking that $500 million that was originally scheduled to be over the next 3 years and accelerating all of that into the current year, which will save additional money when we're putting it in sooner. And then the last point I'll make on the structure is that the surplus for this budget, we're projecting about $5.6 billion, which is not as significant as the approximately $21 billion surplus that we had at the governor's budget last year, but still is significant. However, as discussed, because we are projecting slowing global growth, we believe that most of that surplus is one-time in nature. So the governor's budget is proposing that 80% of that $5.6 billion be devoted to one-time or temporary purposes rather than ongoing spending. So that's the overall structure. The one other thing I'll do is very briefly tick off the 5 major areas where the governor's budget makes new investments. The first is in the area of education and, more broadly speaking, job creation and skills development. The budget proposes additional slots for preschool for low-income children. It devotes the highest ever level of Proposition 98 spending for our schools and community colleges of $84 billion, including a new investment in apprenticeships for our community college students. And then for our K-12 schools, in addition to the increase in the overall level of support, there's also additional funding for special education and nearly $900 million for teacher preparation and teacher development. The budget also proposes base increases of 5% for the UC and CSU systems. And then finally, as all of you know, the legislature did place a bond for school facilities on the ballot for the election that is taking place on March 3rd. That's a $15 billion bond if it is approved by the voters. And of that, $9 billion would be for K-12 facilities as well as preschool facilities. And then the other $6 billion would be split evenly between community colleges, University of California, and CSU. The second area I'll touch on very briefly, and there is a lot in this space, but in the healthcare space, the budget includes a new initiative that the administration is calling the Healthier California for All initiative to transform the way we deliver care and integrate physical and mental health and make sure that we're reaching out to vulnerable populations and getting the most value for the services that we provide and the payments that we make. This includes a special emphasis on mental health as well as reducing the cost of prescription drugs. The budget also includes an expansion of Medi-Cal to the undocumented population aged 65 and above. Right now, under current law, including the most recent Budget Act, Medi-Cal covers the undocumented population up to age 26. So this would propose also covering population age 65 and above. The final 3 areas I'll mention in healthcare is a proposed new tax on vaping to combat the vaping epidemic. new support for the Department of Developmental Services, which is a big priority for so many people who have been working on these issues. And then finally, given some changes that we're expecting in federal regulations, additional support for our food banks for food insecure households. The third area I'll touch on very briefly is on homelessness and housing. Homelessness is one of the biggest issues facing the state. The governor put out an executive order at the beginning of this month deploying state trailers and tents to help deal with immediate needs of different cities across the state and encouraging local governments to cooperate with the state in making progress on this challenge. He also proposed a $750 million fund in the budget called the California Access to Housing and Services Fund to help address the homelessness crisis that we're facing. And when it comes to housing, building on additional multi-billion-dollar commitments in last year's budget, this budget also authorizes further tax credits, the use of excess land for housing, and we in the administration will also propose the creation, explore the creation of a unified housing and homelessness agency. So that's something that we are actively thinking about. And then this is in concert with private efforts. The governor and the administration have secured over $4 billion in private commitments for loans and grants to help build housing in California. The fourth area I'll touch on is the emergency space, and this is everything from climate resilience, where the governor is proposing a $12.5 billion climate budget over the next 5 years, to improving our parks, buying more park land, expanding our parks, and increasing access to parks for underserved populations. And then a number of big new investments in our wildfire preparedness and response, including $120 million to step up our resources for CAL FIRE in terms of firefighter staffing, pre-positioning, and year-round fire engines, as well as on the broader set of emergencies, improving our capabilities for cybersecurity and cyber response, as well as earthquake and seismic safety. The final area I'll touch on very briefly is regard to criminal justice and public safety. The governor has proposed that if current population trends continue, he intends to take action to close a state prison within the next 5 years. Of course, that will depend on continued progress on improving our rehabilitative services and bringing that population down. The budget also proposes new investments in youth and young offenders and making sure that we provide intensive rehabilitative services to them. Also for people in the court system who are low income, reducing the burden of fines and fees. And then finally, 3 other points I'll mention is number 1, a big new initiative on probation reform. Second, changing the collection for cannabis taxes to the point of sale and streamlining that process. And then finally, renaming our Department of Business Oversight to the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, and strengthening it with consumer protection powers, in particular to regulate some of the new fintech financial technology entities, as well as debt collectors, to make sure that consumers and citizens in California are protected. So those are just some of the key areas. There's a lot of different items in this budget, and as you know, this is the governor's proposal. We've already started with legislative overview hearings this past week, and we will continue those, and the governor will put out a revised proposal in May after April income tax collections come through. So that's the general overview, but very happy to take any questions about any area of the budget.
I have a quick one.
Yes.
I know the issue you mentioned, and you touched on it now that we have this huge reserve to start paying down some of the pension liability. And I know a lot of the cities throughout the state are in the same kind of boat where they're constantly looking at that, because in many cities, it's actually kind of hurt them financially to the point that they get under receivership. What is the total amount that we owe at the state level?
Yeah, so basically, if you can divide it into a couple buckets, the first is for CalPERS, and that's about $59 billion, so just under $60 billion. The second is Calstrs, which is the state teachers' retirement system. The overall liability for that is approximately $101 billion. However, about 2/3 of that is actually, under current law, the responsibility of the school districts themselves. So about $33 billion is the responsibility of the state. So when you put those two together, in unfunded pension liabilities, you're looking at approximately $90 billion There are additional, in terms of judges, but it's in the low single digit, so about $90 billion. But then the other bucket that you also have is the unfunded retiree healthcare liability. So this is often known in shorthand as OPEB, other post-employment benefits. And the most recent estimate for that unfunded liability is approximately $86 billion. So you put all that together and you're looking in the range of about $175, $180 billion in terms of what the state is responsible for. So these are very big numbers. I'll just make 2 points, however. Number one is that one of the reasons these numbers are big is that the retirement systems have now begun to use more realistic assumptions and have updated how they're valuing this liability. So taking account of the fact that people are living longer, lowering their expectation for what the markets will return. So we have made some progress, even though those numbers sometimes don't budge as much as we would like. And then the second point is beyond the fact that we have plans in place to pay these off over time, I think that these supplemental contributions that we began making last year will make a difference. In addition, under Proposition 2, there is money that goes to paying off these unfunded liabilities every year. So in this year's budget, along with last year's budget, several $100 million under Proposition 2 goes to pay off some of that retiree health care liability, or rather pre-fund the expenses for the future. And then under our budget, we are proposing in the out year, which is 2023, 2024, an additional $1.1 billion payment to Calstrs, and that's on top of required payments from the state. So these are big numbers. They're not something that can be resolved in a year or 2 years or even 5 years, but we're confident that between the required contribution, the Proposition 2 contributions, and the supplemental payments that we're making, we'll be able to work toward full funding over time.
So if you took whatever the required payment is, and on top of what you're saying, the supplemental that they're making because of this is a good year, what would be the projection? How many years out if you were to continue on the path that you're going now?
Yeah, so it's hard to say, how long it'll take to get to full funding, but what we do have an estimate of is how much these extra payments will ultimately save the state over time, because not only are you reducing the unfunded liability, but by doing that, you're reducing payments that the state would have to make in the future on behalf of taxpayers.
Right.
So we are projecting, for example, that our $3 billion payment to Calstrs will save in over $6 billion ultimately will be returned, over time.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, if I could.
Yes, Mr. Gaines?
Yeah, great. Thank you for your presentation. Very much appreciate it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the rainy day fund. You said that it increased from 19 to 22 billion?
Yeah, so basically, the overall reserves increased from 19 to 21, but the specific rainy day fund that you noted, so that is the bulk of that overall figure. It's not all of it.
Okay.
But that is right now, we're projecting to end the year that we're in right now, which is governed by the budget that passed in June, to end at $16 billion. And then if this budget is enacted, we're expecting that the rainy day fund will go from $16 billion to $18 billion. And so there is actually a cap under Proposition 2 in terms of how big the rainy day fund can be, which is basically 10% of general fund proceeds of taxes. So right now, once that gets to $18 billion, we're projecting that we'll be at 9.8% of that. And then the year after this is assuming the economy continues to grow. Of course, we will all see what happens, but we'll actually reach that 10% cap the year after this one. And then once you reach that 10% cap, the rainy day fund will still grow after that, because each year, as your revenues get a little higher, 10% of that higher number means that you could put more in. But under Proposition 2, any extra money that otherwise would have gone into the rainy day fund is supposed to be devoted to infrastructure projects or investments, so these long-term projects that will benefit the state. So that does have a cap. The other part of Proposition 2, which is these required debt payments, that will continue on up until 2030. So those will continue even after we reach our reserve cap. So, the zooming out just a little bit, the $18 billion, that's a big number. It's certainly bigger than any other state has. And even if you say, well, of course that's true because California has a bigger population, even if you take it as a percentage of general fund, which provides a more apples to apple comparison to other states, we're still comfortably in the upper tier of states when it comes to our rainy day fund. And I think this is one of the reasons why 2 of the ratings agencies upgraded California's bond rating last summer after the budget passed. So it's certainly big. It's still not as big as we would like it to be, because we are projecting that if there is a recession anywhere close to the one that we all experienced a decade ago, that leads to deficits much bigger than $16 billion or $18 billion, especially over more than 1 year. So it wouldn't cover everything by any stretch. But that being said, we do think that we're in a much stronger position this time than we were last time.
I see. Okay, so do you have an idea of how many months you would go out? And let's say you had a moderate recession. How far would $20 billion get you in terms of sustaining budget allocations?
Yeah, so one thing we've done for the Department of Finance is we've tried to model, we can't predict recessions, but we tried to model exactly to your point what would happen if we had one. So we modeled a recession that is maybe not quite as severe as the one we went through 10 years ago, because that was hopefully a once in a generation or even once in a lifetime event, but more severe than the dot-com bust that came at the end of 1990s and 2000s. So pretty significant recession. And under that scenario, over a 3-year period, you could see a revenue drop of between $65 and $70 billion, close to what we projected. Now, that number wouldn't have to plug that full number in the sense of under Proposition 98, some of that would automatically come out of the school budget. So, the schools would automatically take a cut, which would be painful for the schools. And then on top of that, you're dealing with approximately, this is over 3 years, $40 billion budget problem. So, of course, if you have an $18 or $20 billion rainy day fund, but you have a $40 billion hole to plug over multiple years, you're still going to have some painful cuts. But that being said, that $20 billion or whatever is in the rainy day fund will get you a long way. And then the other thing, and I'll double check on this, but I believe under Proposition 2, the legislature can only withdraw half of it in the first year. And that makes sure if there is a recession that goes on over multiple years, you're not dumping all your money from the reserve to plug your hole right in the beginning and then setting yourself up for more pain in the next year or two.
Sure, yeah. It was one of the pieces of legislation I supported when I was in the Senate.
Yes.
And I think it's wise to have it. I want to touch on pensions, if I could, just briefly. Wasn't there an agreement with Calstrs on helping narrow that gap? And wasn't it an obligation of teachers and the state, both kicking in money, employees and?
Yes.
Okay.
So basically.
What is the condition of Calstrs now, given those changes?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And it must have been right around the time in 2014 when Proposition 2 passed. So there was the Calstrs funding bill. And basically that was, I'm sure you remember, that was when Calstrs, the fiscal picture was not looking great for the future of that fund. And so basically what that legislation did is try to put Calstrs on firm fiscal footing where by 2046, so meaning within the next 35 years, the system could move toward full funding. And it basically did that in 3 ways. Number one, it did require significantly more contributions from the state. But in addition to that, to your point, it also required significantly more contributions from the school districts. And in fact, over the last 5 or 6 years, contributions from school districts have just about doubled. Approximately. And so that's where, even though we do have these high funding levels from the state, school districts are also dealing with higher pension and healthcare costs. And so that puts some pressure on the schools, but it comes from a place where we do want to move the system toward full funding. And then finally, on the teacher side.
And just to, is it, because it was my recollection is that Calstrs was in worse shape than CalPERS.
Yes.
Fiscally. And so is it righted to the ship to the point where they're kind of in the same position now in terms of, I know that they're not fully funded.
Yes.
And the number I remember is like 70% funded for
That's
CalPERS?
correct.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So basically, they're in approximately, I forget that it's between 65 and 70%.
Okay.
In terms of that range, in terms of funding. So they have made much more progress. And then the mechanisms are in place for those elevated contributions to continue over time.
Okay, very well. Thank you.
Of course.
Good.
I just have one other one.
Yes, of
You
course.
mentioned, and I'm glad to hear that the governor's really focusing on the affordable housing piece as well as the homeless crisis that we have in the state of California. And I was just wondering with, the BOE, we have a lot of these incentive programs, especially with exemptions, right? For people that are building affordable housing and some of the exclusionary things, policies that we have. I just wanted to get your thoughts. Is there something that maybe we could do to kind of enhance that or to grow it? Because I know in speaking to, even now, the for-profit developers are now looking at housing, building affordable housing, whereas in the past, they were always kind of focused on market rate.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's something in this budget you're mentioning, that he's allocating so much for affordable housing to try to encourage that development to happen, because if we depend on the nonprofit world, it's not going to happen anytime soon, meeting the needs. I believe.
Yes, and so I think that's exactly right, where we do want to make sure that there are incentives in place for developers who are building market rate housing, which also helps address the housing crisis, but we really want to make sure that there are affordable units. And so last year's budget included $500 million for the low-income housing tax credit and mixed income loans, and then this budget puts in another $500 million toward that purpose. And so we are hoping that these credits, tax credits, make affordable housing development more attractive. And so developers understand by competing for these credits and for investors using those credits, that will produce more units. Now, granted, given the scale of the gap that we have to fill, it's also not something that can be solved in a year or two, but certainly the governor wants to go forward with this. He wants to go forward with private commitments. And even though there is a lot in this budget, as probably all of you know from checking with people across Sacramento, the conversation on housing and homelessness is even continuing beyond the budget. And we're all thinking about, legislation in terms of zoning and permitting and thinking about whatever levers we have at our disposal to make progress on this issue.
Well, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none?
Great.
Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Perfect. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So thank you, members. I appreciate it. Again, extend an acknowledgement to Ms. Cohen for opening up the door and extending the invitation. So we appreciate that, and always good to have you join us.
Thank you.
Give me feedback. Talk to you soon. And members, that concludes this month's report.
In your closing, I'm glad that you did recognize our former chair, Ms. Cohen, because I think, this last year was, we were, all of us being all new, I think she took some real good leadership to get this thing going, especially on the affordable housing piece and the informational hearings. And now as we're talking about modernization, it was a lot to handle, and I wanted to thank you, because I know that took a lot of extra time and effort, and your staff as well, I'm sure, that you were riding real hard to make sure that
She's
that
got a
happened.
superhero cape on.
Yes.
Yeah, could I chime in real briefly?
Sure,
I want
go
to
ahead.
thank Valea Cohen for doing a great job as chair. And in particular, in the informational hearing arena, I think that's an area that's so important, and an area for us to get out and get input from our constituents up and down the state. And looking forward to mine coming up in April. So,
Me too.
thank you. All right.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, can we call the next item?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next item is item K2, the Chief Counsel's report. Chief Counsel, Mr. Nanjo, will come forward to present.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning again, Chair Vasquez, members of the board. Again, this is my quarterly update of the legal department status. It's a snapshot. There's a PowerPoint that's been distributed. The first slide after the opening is basically the legal team composition. I'm happy to report we were able to fill a AGPA, or Associate Government Program Analyst, which has been instrumental in getting us a little better organized and getting a little better handle on some of our paperwork and files. In recruitment, we are actively recruiting a Attorney 3 for litigation purposes. That was previously a Tax Council 3 that, because of some challenges we had with the minimum qualifications for that class, we had to go back out and reclass as a Attorney 3, but we are hopefully going to be scheduling, we hopefully will be completing interviews on that in the early part of February and hope to land somebody very quickly after that. And then we have 2 Tax Council positions that we're filling in. So again, we're trying to desperately get up to full staff as quickly as possible. So that's the good news. The next slide, kind of, I've discussed this previously, but this is just a reminder of the various areas in which your legal department operates and the types of needs that we handle for the agency. The important slide is the next one on page 4, and that's what we were able to do over the last quarter. So the good news I'm happy to report is that with the additional staff, typically in the past, we've kind of ground to a halt during this last quarter because, as you know, this is when my attorneys are very actively involved in the state assessed properties tax division appeals, and that takes most of my staff, if not all of them. Because we had a couple extra people, we were able to continue getting out some of the Public Record Act requests, the publications reviews, opinions, technical advice, so we were able to make some progress. Always like to be able to get more. We're still backlogged by probably at least a year or 2 for some of our requests that we have in the queue, but we are making progress. The next couple slides talks about the different categories. Again, this is a repeat from what I previously provided the board, but again, gives you an indication of what we have in the different categories. Workload highlights on page 7. We go to regulations. One of the big things that we've been working on is, as you know, because the assessors and this board has been able to work out a resolution of the certificated aircraft valuation and taxing, we've had to modify our rules to comport with those new regulations and statutes, and that's been done. We provided the emergency regs that took effect immediately, and we're now in the process of completing the permanent regulations because, as you know, the emergency regulations are for a short duration. Slide 8 talks about the technical advice in the areas. Again, our most popular areas of inquiry are questions about various forms of legal entities and exemptions and change of ownership questions. Slide 9 talks about the whole of 2019. I was asked to kind of provide an overview of how much work the legal department does over the course of a calendar year. So this shows that we've worked on 1,077 projects. And for a team as small as mine, I think that shows that my team was working very hard. So we appreciate the support the board members give us. And finally, on page 10 is the workload pending. We still have 103 items that are in our queue. We're actively working on those to try to work those down, and I think the additional staff will help. So with that, that's my snapshot for this quarter. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to address them. Member Schaefer.
Mr. Nanjo, I'd asked a question earlier when Ms. Fleming was there as to the difference between certificated aircraft and uncertificated aircraft. You only speak as to certificated aircraft.
Certificated aircraft are the aircraft that the board has, the assessors have some jurisdiction over, and that refers to an FAA certification. So there are uncertificated aircraft. Those are usually smaller aircraft. The certificated aircraft that we deal with is essentially the commercial airliners.
So they don't escape taxation, they just are handled differently.
They are handled in a different manner. That's correct, sir.
Yes, Ms. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Nanjo. Mr. Nanjo, where are your legal opinions captured in the workload matrix?
Those are under technical advice.
Under technical advice. I see technical subject matter advice. That's, yeah, I guess. All right, thank you.
Yeah, so under depending on which metrics you're looking on, I think there's a category called technical advice. And for example, on page,
Looks like 8, right?
yeah,
And page 3.
For the quarterly, at least.
yeah.
Oh,
For example, on page 9, the technical advice comes in different forms: emails, letters and memos, phone calls, and special projects.
Are you able to provide some indication, some metric on the average length of time it takes to respond to these legal opinions?
You know, I can provide you, it really is, depends on the complexity of the questions. Some of the questions that we get by phone calls, maybe it's something that we can quickly answer, sometimes in the same day. Other inquiries we get are very complex. They may require some research, and those may take several months, candidly. A lot of the more complex matters, Member Cohen, are things like exemption, questions about whether or not a legal entity qualifies for an exemption or qualifies for that kind of charitable, they're considered a charitable organization, because what we'll do is we'll engage with the member or person asking us the question, try to find out about the organization. A lot of times, we'll ask for additional documentation and do quite a bit of research on those matters.
So the reason why I raised the question is that I just wanted to make sure that we are managing our responses to assessors, to the assessors' offices. I know that your team is working diligently, but I want to make sure we have turnaround, a quick turnaround, quick and thorough, I should say, turnaround.
Yeah. One of the things we do is we do prioritize our requests. So the assessors, because we're kind of their go-to source for expertise, we prioritize those above inquiries from members of the public. One of the things we do to try to make sure that the poor members of the public aren't last on the queue is a lot of times we'll suggest that members of the public, if they partner with their assessor's office and it's a joint request from the assessor and the member of the public, then we give those a higher priority.
How do you prioritize requests? I mean, when you've got a handful of requests, how do you triage them and determine which is a higher priority over the
What we're
others?
looking for is, as I mentioned, requests from assessors are priority. If there's some time constraint involved, you know, it's something that's needed to forestall litigation, you know, they're either in litigation or it's a situation where litigation is imminently going to be filed. If they don't get a response within a certain amount of time, we'll try to prioritize those ahead and try to make those deadlines. Generally speaking, we try to triage the most important things that provide relief for either assessors or taxpayers first, and then we try to do the other things as the case may be. We do have some taxpayers that are, it doesn't seem like it's related to a case or something. If I can characterize it such, we have one regular person who inquires to us about hypotheticals and gives us 5 or 6 hypotheticals and says, well, in these 5 or 6 cases, what would the rules be on this? And he never gives an indication that this is relating to a particular client or a matter that he has, so those are lower priority because they're not time constrained.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
But along those lines, what would you say right now is your top workload priorities?
The top workload priorities are always, well, first of all, we try to give the most priority to internal staff. So if there's program staff that has items that they need to do to move forward a regulation or something to that effect, we'll give those the top priorities. We have quite a few of those. And then the next priority is those from the assessors. And those come in with varying timelines. Sometimes it's they need the answer in a few months, 6 months. Sometimes they need the answer more quickly than that, and we try to oblige those as well.
And I guess the next one is, the board meeting reference manual. I know you're revising that as we speak. When do you think that will be ready? And are you going to be able to provide maybe the old with the new so we can kind of compare the differences?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay.
My understanding of the board member reference manuals, it's in final review, which means that the process is legal and board proceedings has gone through it, kind of made the updates we suggested. We've sought advice and collaboration from program staff. That's been done. We've implemented all the edits. I believe, not to put pressure on our executive director, but I think it's in executive office review, or it may be actually past that and being finalized as we speak. So we hope to have that to the board members in the next month or two.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Just in talking to my county assessors in my district, I get a lot of compliments on
great. Thank you.
your ability to respond and get the information that they need. So I appreciate what you're doing in that regard. And also speaks to David Young, too. I just want to let you know, I've gotten a number of comments on how you're able to answer questions and satisfy needs of assessors. And so keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir. I'm very proud of my legal team, but I don't want to sell short program. Program helps us out a lot. If it's a matter that we think program staff can answer, a lot of times we'll shift it over to Mr. Young's staff, and his staff helps supplement our ability to respond. So we're between legal and program. We work very closely to try to get people asking us questions, the answer as quickly as possible.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Davis, we're going to have the next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next item is item K3, the Property Tax Director's Report. Mr. Young, Chief of Property Tax Division, will now come forward to present.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Vasquez, Vice Chair Schaefer, members of the board. My name is David Young. I'm the Deputy Director of the Property Tax Department of the board. With me here is Ms. Patricia Lumsden. She is the manager of the County Assessed Properties Division, the Technical Services unit, and she will be giving a presentation on our letters to assessors, and in specific, a recap of the last quarter's activities.
Good morning, Chair Vasquez and board members. As David Young indicated, my name is Patty Lumsden, and I'm with the manager of the Assessment Services and Training Unit for the County Assessed Properties Division of the Board of Equalization's Property Tax Department. Today I'm going to be giving you a brief report on the letters to assessors that were issued in 2019, which will include a report on the fourth quarter LTAs. So just as a brief reminder for those that are not familiar with what letters to assessors are, they are advisory letters issued by the Board of Equalization to all county assessors and interested parties. They provide interpretations of rules, laws, and court decisions, or general information on property tax assessment. So you see on the table, these are the numbers of letters to assessors that were issued in 2019. There were 7 in the first quarter, 12 in the second quarter, 13 in the third quarter, and 18 in the fourth quarter, for a total of 50 letters to assessors that were issued. And then just for some information, I provided a list of all of the letters to assessors that were issued in the fourth quarter of 2019. And they, as you can see, there are a variety of information. Some of them are annual information that we release annually. Also, there are some assessors' handbooks that were issued. There's information in regards to statute or regulation changes, and just a variety. There's a survey report in there as well, and just kind of gives you an idea of the different types of LTAs that we release. So then the last slide, again, gives you resources for those who wish to receive letters to assessors. They are distributed by email only, and to receive all LTAs as they are released via email, then you can use the link as shown on the slide. Also, you can access all the letters to assessors on our website, and the link is also provided. And that concludes my report. If you have any questions.
Yes, are these sent to us members without us asking for it? I mean, it's in our Outlook account. I would like to review them, and I don't know that I've been seeing them.
Yes.
Yes, sir. They are sent to you. I believe it's a 2-day review, so they are sent to you prior to release.
Any further?
If I could, just
Yes.
clarification. So a letter to assessor could include a survey?
Yes, the survey reports are issued by letter to assessor.
Okay. And an audit?
What type of, I'm not sure what you mean by audit.
Okay, survey can be an audit, right? I mean,
Yes,
it depends on how deep the dive is for the county assessor's office, isn't it?
Yes, the surveys are actually, for lack of a better word, a compliance audit
Yeah.
that we do on the county assessor's practices and their procedures. And the survey itself is actually announced through an LTA. So when it's published, that's how we alert basically the world to this has been completed and it's available for you to review online.
I see, okay.
Yes.
And just as further clarification, I believe too that that would be whether they did a, just a true audit or if they did a sampling, whatever they did for that
Thank you.
report, that would be the LTA.
Yeah, it would still be considered a letter.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes, okay. I'm just, I don't know how the board feels and the executive director, but I just find it confusing because letters seem so broad, and it'd be nice to know whether is it an advisory or is it an audit, is it a sample, and could we look at the nomenclature in terms of how we're describing these things so that there's more clarity? I think from someone from the outside looking in is not going to have clarity when we talk about letters to assessors, because it'd be nice for me if they were just broken out. You know, how many advisory letters are we sending out? How many audits are we performing? How many surveys are we performing? And then call them accordingly.
I think I understand. If I can provide a little bit of history as to why they're called LTAs. LTAs are just that, they're letters to assessors, and it used to be our primary, before we had this wonderful thing called the internet. This is how we basically made announcements and communications to the assessors in specific and to all stakeholders in general. This is something either the board is doing or guidance the board is giving. And I understand it may be perhaps a little bit cumbersome to go through each one to figure out which ones are advisory versus which ones are merely announcements. But the evolution of it is that it was basically a tool just to basically disseminate what the board is doing.
Sure. I'm just saying it's still cumbersome.
Right. No.
And it'd be nice to have clarity.
Okay. Okay.
So.
Well, you know, along those lines, are you planning on updating some of the older letters that we've had to assessors? And I'm thinking especially, you know, in light of some new legislation that's been passed as it pertains to, I'm thinking, you know, as we heard from the governor's staff earlier about affordable housing, for example, and, you know, the welfare exemption that we have within the BOE.
Well, when we do have updates, like I said earlier, due to legislative changes, we do issue letters to assessors to indicate what those changes, those upcoming changes are going to be. So if there is something that's out there, then we do make them aware of that, and we do make changes with footnotes until we can actually get to, like, say, a handbook. If there's information in a handbook that we become aware of becomes outdated, until we can actually work on that handbook, we do put a notation in the handbook for them to be able to see that a change has been made. So we do that, if that's what you're referring to.
And if I may also add to, if there is a law change that supersedes advice given in an LTA, we won't note that on the LTA. We'll note that this LTA has been superseded by a more current LTA, which reflects the law changes. So there is a running chronology of all our advices, and those which are no longer relevant because of law changes, we do note that they've been superseded.
It looks like Ms. Fleming wants to weigh in.
No, I just want to be here to support staff and to answer the question. We're happy to, as a part of the modernization, revitalization, and moving forward for our strategic plan, we can take a look at those things. So certainly there's history to the letters to assessors, affectionately referred to as LTAs, to see what we can do to make it more clear. So we don't want to necessarily interfere with, some of the things that are by statute, et cetera. We want to be in compliance, but to the extent that we can bring some clarity for the external stakeholders and make sure that we're consistent with moving forward, we're happy to take a look at that matter.
That'd be great. Maybe even the way it's presented, when you give us the updates, if it was broken out. So if you let's see here, I'm just looking at the listing that you're showing. If we could break it out by, survey or handbook. We have a column for surveys, a column for handbook, a column for advisory letters. That'd be clearer to me.
Yeah, the possibility of adding another
What's falling
element.
under which category?
Certainly.
Versus having a listing that has them all kind of mixed up.
Right, understood, yeah.
So
We'll take a look at it.
that's great. Wonderful. Thank you.
What if,
Mr. Schaefer?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
What if a recipient of a letter to the editor, or letter to the assessor, doesn't like what it says? Do they talk to us? They talk to, are we the letter writer, or is that you?
Well, it depends on the letter. Sometimes the letter provides guidance, and sometimes that guidance is actually board-adopted guidance. In that case, it would be presented before the board for your adoption. Sometimes the letters are just merely that, they're just announcements. We're starting a project on something, and sometimes the letters are,
Sometimes they're controversial, sometimes they're not.
sometimes they're not. That is correct. Like publicly, if you look at LTA 2019-039, taxable publicly owned land, that is only an announcement of a factor, and that's embedded in the statute, is calculated, and it's just announced. So it all depends on what we're announcing. If it's guidance, if it's just advice, they would probably call us first. If it's board-adopted guidance, they're always welcome to call
And
everybody on
the
the
member
board,
through
including.
his or her office always has notice of what you're doing.
Yes.
I have nothing further, thank you.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'm looking over, and it looks like we need a break for our recorder here, and I was thinking maybe we're pretty close to lunch. What's the will? Should we go ahead and break for lunch now, or just do a 15-minute break? You want to do the lunch break now?
I'm okay with lunch now,
So we'll do a 45-minute break?
if it's the will of the board.
Is that what
Yeah.
everybody's comfortable with? All right, we will take a 45-minute break for lunch. Meeting, and if I can have Ms. Davis call up the next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next item is K4A, Legislative Research and Statistics Division Chief's Report. Mr. Durham will provide an update on legislative bills impacting the BOE. Mr. Durham is here to provide that report. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Vasquez and honorable members, Mark Durham with the Research and Legislative Division. So first to begin, our legislative calendar, dates of interest. We have January 31st is the last day for each house to pass bills introduced in that house in the odd number year. And February 21st is the last day for bills to be introduced. So moving on to the bills of interest for BOE that were introduced last year. We had AB 576, and that was heard on January 23rd in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, and it was held under submission, which means that it was an action taken by the committee, but there was no motion for the bill to progress out of that committee, but it's still considered active until January 31st. The other bill was ACA 2, and this was assigned to the Assembly Revenue Tax Committee on May 24th of last year. And this is still an active bill. It's still in the committee process. And since this is a constitutional amendment, the January 31st deadline does not adhere to this one. The date that that one important date is the June 25th date. So it has to be over to the Secretary of State on June 25th, 2020, for the Secretary to determine that it qualifies for the November 3rd ballot. And then bills of interest that are introduced this month, we have a couple of them. We have AB 1959, Mays, which is Property Tax Assessment Appeals. And this provides when a property owner appeals an assessment, the date on which the taxes are due and payable must be told during the dependency of the appeal. The second one is AB 1977, Bonta, which is a museum property tax welfare exemption. And this prohibits an assessor from denying a claim for the welfare exemption for the property that is used exclusively for the charitable purposes of museums. So we haven't done the analysis of those since we just got those, but the analysis should be coming out shortly. And then for the BOE's proposed legislation, the four that I presented in December, the Senate Governors and Finance Committee has agreed to take those bills, those four technical bills for us, and they're putting those into a committee omnibus bill. So we should be on the lookout for those probably maybe late February on those. And that does it for my update. Any questions?
You know, I really like this form that you came up with. I think this is really good in terms of just kind of not tracking these things. My only question is that now in light, well, I guess we have until the 31st. So after the 31st, if this 576 doesn't move anywhere, what does that do to ACA 2? Does it,
They're on separate tracks.
separate tracks? So,
Correct.
so
So
at the end of the day
576,
for them, the date for them is, you said it's a June, I thought it was a July, so now it's a June 25th date?
well, it's June 25th because it's 131 days
Before the
prior.
election?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions from?
No, I
Mr.
do
Gay?
appreciate this format. Thank you for
Okay.
breaking out the way you have
That's
it.
real helpful.
And can I ask a question on one here, AB 1959 Mays? And so is the intent to defer any payment of tax until the appeal is decided? Is that?
I haven't dug into this one because, like I said, we just got this.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're still doing the analysis on it.
Okay.
So, but once we get that, we'll brief you on
You
it.
can give us an update next month or?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Mhm.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Oh, great, thank you.
Ms. Davis, if we can call the next item?
Our next item are the L items, board member requested matters. Item L1 is California Complete Count 2020 Census, presented by Chairman Vasquez. There is also a speaker, Ms. Lizette Mata, Deputy Secretary of State Operations. If she is with us, if she can come forward at this time? Okay.
I don't see her. So why don't we go ahead and, let's just skip that and we'll come back to that item.
Okay.
Let's go to the next one.
Absolutely. Our next item is L2, Board Member Strategic Planning Session, presented by Chairman Vasquez.
Yes, I hope everybody had an opportunity to take a look at what we received from our strategic plan. You know, the fellow that we had that was working with us, Eric, I think did a real good job of kind of laying this thing all out for us. And I think the symposium documents and the key points that we discuss at the work sessions, as I look through it, to me, I think one of the key things that we need to do is to get into some discussions. At the end of the day, I want to make sure that as people look through this, especially the members up here, if there's any changes or recommendations that we need to make, that we make those accordingly, and then begin to exercise and start working on our action plan. And we have a spreadsheet that once we get feedback from you all today, I'll have my staff go through it and we'll present an action plan on all the next steps that we need to take. And I guess one of the things I want to stress to ourselves as members here, that this is actually the strategic plan for the members, not for the staff. There is some of the work plan as we look at this that we discussed in the strategic plan where the staff, I know Ms. Fleming's will take responsibility for it, but I think there's only really 2 items, and when we get to them, we'll raise those. But for the most part, this is an action plan for us as members and our staff to carry out. So I want to just be clear that we're not adding any more responsibilities or duties to the staff, but rather these are the responsibilities and duties that we're going to take on as a board. So if I could just draw your attention, well, to when we're looking at the strategic plan, we got into our goals, and of the 3, I wanted to hear from the members here which ones they might want to take responsibility for. And in looking at these, what I was kind of envisioning is that, on some of them, it may be 1 or 2 members. Obviously, the max it'd be 2. But others that some might feel that they can handle by themselves, I'd appreciate for them to step up so we can kind of divvy up the work that needs to be done. And with that, let me just kind of open it up. I have several suggestions and questions I want to raise, but let me open it up to the floor right now, to the members, and see what people's initial thoughts are. And we'll start with Member Cohen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Chair Vasquez, I actually appreciate the documents that you've presented today, and really grateful that we are where we are. Actually, it took us about 1 year's time to get to where we are. The last year, I was focused on primarily helping the organization rebuild itself and to stand itself back up, and that include paying attention to the budget, increasing the budget, paying careful attention to the vacancies, recruiting, and then also maintaining the current employees as well as recruiting new employees. And I'm really excited. I would recommend that we have this conversation and this discussion today. I also want to recommend that we provide ourselves opportunities to review the document further, but I am prepared to have a conversation. I am interested in owning a portion of the strategic plan. I'm interested in continuing the work that I started last year with rebuilding the organization and partnering with BOE staff. Also, again, I want to just highlight it on the record that my primary focus is going to be focusing on BOE staff, focusing on the BOE organization, probably less as a secondary notion, focusing on individual members' offices, but I think that the primary focus should be on the organization, maintaining the organization's integrity and continuing to build so we can use that momentum as we go into 2020 and beyond. Thank you.
Great. And before I turn to my left to the other 2 members, I know in our conversation, in our discussion, we were looking at the strategic plan. Yvette seemed to be interested, and I think she was going to work with Ms. Fleming's on this, is to kind of take the portion that we talked about in the strategic plan that kind of looks at the history and some of the things that we did or didn't do, and now some of the things that we can't, that we used to do in the past. And I think it kind of centers more around, now after AB 102, what our responsibilities are, and to keep that kind of in line. So I'm going to leave that, and since Yvette isn't with us here, so we're going to give her that assignment since she slipped out. But no, I think she's in agreement with it. But at the end of the day, I'm looking forward for her to work along with Ms. Fleming, and if there's any other member that wants to join her, you're welcome to do so as well.
I just want to,
Oh,
if
sure.
I could
Go
just
ahead.
finish off my remarks.
sorry. Go
And it
ahead.
was an afterthought. Goal one, I wanted to, let me read it into the record so everyone could follow along and know what I'm talking about. Goal one of the executive summary says, ensure the board's constitutional mandates are being performed in the most cost-effective, efficient, and timely manner, with the infrastructure necessary for the Board of Equalization and board members to accomplish their workload. Of the three priorities and 4 action items, we establish 2 actions need a commitment. Conduct a formal review/survey of BOE staffing needs and gaps. This is post AB 102, and identifying priorities. And then the second goal is conduct a formal review survey of board members' offices' needs, identifying gaps and required resources. So again, I just wanted to be very clear that this is the area that I'm interested in. I would also be interested in rewording the action item. I think we should also consider rewording the goal one so that it's a little bit cleaner. But I will own that
right.
and bring it back to the group.
I appreciate it.
So not necessarily conducting a survey, but definitely conducting a formal review of where our staffing needs are. Okay,
That works.
thank you.
Any comments on my left here? Yes,
Yeah,
Mr. Gaines?
I'm interested in goal number 3, which is develop an education outreach plan.
Yes.
And I'm already kind of on that track with you.
Yes.
But we also, talked about, what are the constraints as a result of AB 102 in terms of how we can educate the public in general, outreach to whether it's schools or people in the community, business owners, whoever that group might be. So
I will work with you on that.
yeah, that'd be great. Wonderful. I think there's a lot of, if we can get the clarity in terms of what we can do under AB 102, then that kind of sets the template. And certainly we need to do the educational aspect that we've already talked about, and we're working on in further detail later on in the agenda. So.
I appreciate that. Any other thoughts or suggestions?
We're still on L2.
Yes.
Are we having?
We're actually, we're kind of, right now, we're just kind of focusing on, I don't know if you had a chance to kind of go through the document that was presented to us, and then my staff took it upon themselves to bring it back and kind of update us on what we did on the strategic plan, based on the report we got from Eric. Then if you look at it, the priorities, it looks like now, well, Ms. Cohen's already taken some leadership and working with, really what she started at the beginning of last year was the whole issue of trying to get a better handle on where we are in terms of our needs for staffing, not only internally within the members, but then also within the BOE staff as well. And then I had mentioned earlier that I'm looking for Yvette to work alongside with Ms. Fleming's on some of the history, prior to AB 102 and then now post AB 102, what we can and can't do. And actually, that kind of ties into what Mr. Gaines just raised in terms of the educational outreach. Hopefully that will kind of feed into it, even though I think we have a little bit of some leeway in terms that we've had some discussions about this, and we'll pursue that, but we'll definitely need to check in with Ms. Fleming's and Yvette as they move forward and they present some of the history, so we make sure we're not violating some of that legislation that was already passed. But obviously, trying to, in my opinion, kind of try to push the envelope so we can do as much as we can within the parameters that we have now under post AB 102. I'm sorry, Mr. Schaefer?
Mr. Prang is coming up, is he?
Yes, actually, his staff is here already. So, yeah, that'll come up after this item.
And I want to be heard on Bagley Keene briefly.
Okay. Well, along those lines, as I was looking at the feedback here, there might be an opportunity as you look at the goals to try to weave that in as well.
Sure.
Okay.
My prepared remarks are part of the content we all have here.
Thank you. Anything else? Hearing none, then what I would suggest is that our next board meeting in February, that we all come prepared to come back and kind of give an update of where we're at on our specific task. I already heard from Ms. Cohen that she's prepared to kind of reword or, the actual goal herself and make some changes to try to make it a little bit more clear and more precise, and we appreciate that. Myself and Mr. Gaines will take a look at the outreach, and then I will take the responsibility of reaching out to Ms. Yvette to make sure that she knows what her role and responsibilities will be for the next meeting, and give you an update on that as well. And I'm sorry, and then Ms. Cohen?
Yes, thank you. One thing that I also wanted to tease out, it was in the report, but I might have overlooked it in the executive summary, but just want to add to the document an agency branding campaign.
Oh, sure.
We talked a lot about that. And then, again, this is an agency, BOE agency branding campaign that I believe would be helpful with the recruitment and as well as retention for employment. Okay.
And I'm just receiving a note that looks like Lisette might rejoin us here in, well, no, actually, this is on the census. Okay, so we have about another 5 minutes before she joins us as one of our guest speakers, so.
So just also as a reminder, the last time we met and we were discussing this topic of the strategic plan, we agreed to review the document and provide edits for the next meeting.
Yes.
I brought with me a couple of my edits. Perhaps next month when we get together, everyone will be able to bring some of their thoughts with them.
Sure. So if you, as you look at this document, if you have any changes or if your staff wants to take a look at it, by all means, let's try to feed them in, and then so at our next meeting in February, we can begin to refine it and hopefully crystallize it a little bit.
All right, maybe.
If there's no other comments or suggestions, we will go ahead and go on to the next item.
Our next item is L3, Workforce Planning Work Group, presented by Chairman Vasquez. Chairman Vasquez will introduce the item as well as the speaker.
Great.
Yes, this is an item we've been discussing for some time, mostly with my assessor, Jeff Prang in LA County. But he got hit with, I guess, that flu that's going around. So he texted me yesterday, and he was still trying to come out here, but he says, you know what? And actually, George Renke, who's here with us today from his office, is one of the principal authors and has got quite a bit of history with LA County assessors in terms of work and specifically on this issue. And it goes back to the one when I think I raised it with the membership back in, I think it was November the first time, when we talked about creating some kind of an emergency certificate, with or without the split roll going forward. It's specifically in LA County, there's a huge demand and need to generate more appraisers that can actually help with the workload. Because in our conversations with Jeff, even without split roll going forward, they're losing quite a bit of folks just based on retirement, and then others that are just going into the private sector. And we were trying to come up with a system or a process where we can start backfilling that as quick as possible. And in our discussion, and I raised it, using the example that we did with the emergency credential back in the day when there was such a high demand for teachers, specifically bilingual, special ed, and math teachers. And we kind of use that template, and in bouncing that idea off of George and Jeff back in LA, they were already kind of thinking along the same lines, and they've actually kind of crafted some ideas and suggestions. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to George Renke and have him give his presentations, and then give the members here an opportunity to ask any questions and see if we can take this to the next level. Thank you for coming up, George.
Thank you, Chairman Vasquez, members of the board. Pleasure to be here to present on this topic. I wanted to start off by, taking a step back. This is an ongoing challenge for us as far as training staff and, bringing on new staff. But what has brought this up to a level of urgency is the potential for a split role, which you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. For LA County specifically, I wanted to walk through some of the numbers so that you would have an idea of what the impact would be on our county. This would certainly be an impact throughout the state, but specifically to LA County, the numbers are startling as far as what it would take to get prepared to implement the split roll. And that is certainly our focus, that we want to make sure that if the voters decide to implement the split roll, that we would actually be able to administer it and be ready to make sure it is fully implemented. The impact for Los Angeles County, we have about 177,000 properties that fall into this category of commercial industrial. Most of those in those categories are improved properties. Another 21% of those properties are vacant land, and another 8% would be recreational, institutional, oil and mining, golf courses, these sorts of properties. Our current workload, as far as properties that turn over that have to be valued based on Prop 13, is in a range of 6,000 to 10,000. So that is our current workload. Moving on to the next slide, the proposal would require that the assessor revalue property at least once every 3 years. So the impact would be a third of that 177,000 properties that we would have to value each year, and to have the staff to value those properties. So approximately, we're going from 6,000 to 10,000 up to about 59,000 properties per year. So it's about a tenfold increase in the number of properties. Currently, our staffing overall for appraisers is about 550 in the department. About 140 of those appraisers do commercial industrial properties. The estimate at this point, as far as to take on the new workload, we would need another 500 commercial industrial appraisers. And our commercial industrial appraisers take much longer to get up to speed. So what we're going to be talking about is being able to onboard new staff and new appraisers, but then even beyond when we bring them on board, it takes at least another 5 years to train them to get to the point where they're valuing commercial industrial properties. Currently, our training program in LA County, we have an intensive one-year training program. After we bring candidates in, our minimum requirement is a 4-year degree to start the program. We put them through testing just to get your foot in the door. That initial test, typically only about 15 to 20% of the candidates pass that initial exam. For instance, we have an exam going on right now where there's 2,000 applicants. We're expecting that the initial exam will reduce that number down to about 300, and then ultimately we will hire about 30 appraisers, which is our capacity as far as bringing on a new class, and that's a physical limitation as far as classroom size and instructors, et cetera. The program will consist of about 3 months of classroom training. There's an additional 3 months of in-the-field training, and then the other 6 months is on the job. And there's different variations as to how we conduct that in, between classroom and going to the field, et cetera, throughout that year. At the end of the year, they will take their certification exam. So we'll go from a temporary certification, which they will have during the first year, and then they will get their permanent certification from the board as a permanent appraiser to do valuations for property tax purposes. The The limitation, at most, we would probably be able to bring on 2 classes, which would be maybe 2 classes of 30 each. Typically, we lose anywhere from 3 to 5 per class. So at the end of the year, we would end up being able to bring on maybe 50 new appraisers. Our typical attrition in any given year is typically between 25 and 30. So our current program of bringing in 1 class a year basically just keeps us up with attrition, where if split roll goes through, we're going to have to bring on 500 new appraisers and get them up to speed, which takes a number of years to do the commercial industrial problems. So this is the dilemma that we are currently facing. And, from a statewide perspective, LA is the only county that has this type of training program. So for most of the other counties, they will do, on-the-job type training and preparation for certification, et cetera. So there is, as you can see, there will be an urgent need to have a program beyond what we're capable of, bringing on those numbers of appraisers. The estimates statewide right now is over 1,000 appraisers that will be needed, and they simply aren't in the market currently. So we will have to put in new processes where we can bring them on board and train them and get them up to speed so that we can meet the need. The ideas for the college-based training, one, as I've mentioned, it's going to be needed to supplement what we can do on our own. Regardless of how much we can expand our program, we won't be able to expand it to the point where we can meet the need per split roll, and we're even struggling at this point to keep up with the current need. So this is actually something that would be needed regardless of whether split roll goes through or not. And it also, there's a benefit to the public as it's, offering an alternative vocational track for people to pursue a career in real estate. So this is something, for instance, when I was going through school, there was no course. I always had an interest in real estate, but there was nothing offered that gave you a specific track to pursue that field. So this would be a definite benefit for people that are interested in this area and would like to focus on real estate, not only specifically for the assessor's office, but other fields related to that. The proposal is for 2 different tracks. One would be for candidates that have their 4-year degree that would be similar to the program we have currently that we offer in Los Angeles County that would give them the coursework needed to get the certification and also the background in the classes needed. The other track would be for new candidates that are just entering in the college level, where we could offer a 2-year program, associate's degree, where they could get the same level of expertise plus the other courses needed to get the AA degree to enter in. So we'd have 2 different tracks of candidates that would be coming into the system. The first track would consist of the courses that we're teaching now, which is to lay the foundation, where we teach real estate principles and practices. And then we also cover the 3 approaches, so the cost approach, the market approach, and the income approach, to get them to a level of proficiency where they can do the job, and this will provide the foundation that they need. So this would supplement our current program so that we could bring in bigger numbers. We would still have to do the on-the-job training and the field training, but we would have that basis, which would add to our current program. The second track would be a AA degree, and this would again allow and give the same basis plus the additional courses that are required to receive that degree, and then we would need to bring them in and give them training possibly during the process. So if they wanted to do some type of internship while they're going through the program, and we could employ them as what we currently have is a appraiser assistant program. So in other words, they are not able to apply judgment, but they can do a lot of the other type of work that appraisers are required to do, such as diagramming. This would also be a benefit for our current staff. So we have a lot of non-appraisal staff. As you can see from the earlier numbers presented, more than half of our staff are not in the appraisal category. So it would also offer another career path for our current staff that are interested in pursuing a career in appraisal, which have a lot of the other background that's necessary for doing valuations for property tax purposes. So we are very much interested in working with the board and also the community colleges to develop this type of program, and are interested in doing that as soon as possible so that we could set up a pilot program based on our current needs, and then make sure that we are prepared in case the split roll goes through, that we would be able to quickly expand this program so that we can meet the needs. Thank you.
Any comment? Oh, yes, Ms. Cohen.
A couple things. Thank you. Great presentation. Nice
Thank
to
you.
see you up in Northern California. Before the end of the year, I had a conversation with the community college chancellor that is similar in concept to, quite frankly, what you've presented today. And I, too, have been in conversations with many assessors, including Mr. Prang. I've got a few questions that I want to run by you and definitely get on the record. How would the program be funded?
That I don't know.
Okay, that's a fair.
I have a que- I
You
have
got an
an
answer?
I have an answer. Actually, in our first meeting with this was with the community college chancellor, the LA Community College, who was responsible for 9 campuses, because that was a question we raised in our initial meeting when it was just Jeff, myself, and him, and some staff. And he said that he would take responsibility for that, because what happens is kind of like you have in the K-12 system, where the schools get ADA, they get, I don't know if it's called ADA, but it's something similar at the community college level for students. So he says, you're getting the students, like you mentioned, you have 20 or 30 in a class, that income from the state would cover all his expenses.
Okay,
So it'd be a in terms of asking for money from the budget or anything, it wouldn't be an issue for us.
Okay,
'Cause that
so-
was the question we asked as
So
well.
it sounds like the program could possibly be funded
Yes.
through state dollars. I'm curious to know, have you identified a college partner?
We have reached out and had discussions with the community counselor, or community college chancellor, and they appear to be interested in the program and said that it is doable.
How would potential candidates sign up?
I would assume that they would sign up the same way they would sign up for a community college program. So I imagine that the application process would be similar.
Do you envision this, this program exclusively for LA County?
No, I think it should be applied statewide.
Okay. So I've started a similar discussion with the assessors in my district, with the college chancellor, and we've been discussing creating a pilot program of this nature that we could ultimately take to scale. And Member Gaines pointed this out earlier today, that we received significant feedback on our informational hearings. And what we did as a result of those informational hearings is that we agreed to bring that expertise and talent into a convening and begin moving in earnest in this direction to fulfill this important work. I've got assessors and external stakeholders who want to partner with us in addressing these important issues. And again, just to highlight the issues are recruitment, retention, training, continuous education, and of course, compensation. Compensation. So, Mr. Chair, I would strongly recommend that we move forward in creating a venue for this important discussion to take place so that we can really start to move forward and put action behind our words. And I know individuals who are patiently waiting to join us on this journey. I'd like to bring them into the conversation. One of which is, as I mentioned earlier, I met with the chancellor for all of city colleges for this entire state of California, and he has offered to make one of his team members available to participate in the working group, and so I recommend that we accept his offer And also want to acknowledge that the Chancellor has recommended a pilot proposal that would be extremely beneficial in addressing our appraiser pipeline issues. And so we haven't quite gotten an update on the work group work. So I may be jumping the gun a little bit, and I apologize for that. But this is, I think, a really good resource that I wanted to bring to the table. And I guess at some point you could share with us the names of the members of the work group that you've been working with or meeting with, or who and when do you plan to convene the first work group meeting?
Yes, along those lines, what we did is that in our initial meeting, when we were talking to the chancellor for the LA Community College in LA, who represents the 9, he was looking at kind of doing this as a pilot, with the 9 schools, and then taking this statewide. But if you're telling me you have interest already from the state,
Yeah.
I think we welcome it. We could, I know Jeff and I call him Francisco, but I think his last name is Rodriguez, from the LA Community College chancellor down in LA. He's just waiting. Every time I bump into him at a reception or a meeting, he's asking me, he says, well, did you get approval from the BOE? We want to get this thing going.
That's good to hear.
And actually, they had a press conference that was talking more about free tuition at the community colleges last week. And at that press conference, he was there, and we had members from the Board of Supervisors of LA County, and Hilda Solis being one of them. When she heard me overheard our discussion, she was quick to say, you know what, if you need the whole Board of Supervisors on board, I will get that for you.
Well, let me
So,
ask you, when do you plan to convene the first work group?
I'm ready. I mean, if there's a consensus I'm hearing from the membership here, we'll schedule it as soon as I can pin down Jeff and the chancellor
Okay.
for a date, and we'll definitely let you, the members, know. So if you have, because I know Mr. Gaines also expressed an interest with one of his presidents of one of his community colleges in his district, and no,
So
it's an open.
So it sounds like we need to have a meeting, we start to invite your contacts, the one that I've reached out to. Sounds like the beginnings of a really strong work group so that we can move forward with some urgency. Mr. Gaines, what was the name of the persons that you were thinking about inviting to the work group?
So I met with Willie Duncan at Sierra College. Yeah, and he was very open and willing to participate. He talked about a program that they had through the Building Industry Association, a 12-week program, and they just graduated a cohort of 25 students. All of them had jobs after the program.
Wow.
And so I think, this is something that is going to be longer term and more complex. But if we design it in the right way, I think we have a real opportunity here to fill the need. I just want to make sure that we know what the need is before we launch. And so I'd love to have Don Gakel and the Education Committee at the California Assessors Association tell us, because they're on the ground, right? And Jeff is. You know what the needs are in your counties from an educational workforce development perspective. And so I think they'll provide the information in terms of what kind of classes should we be providing, where are there shortages, are there new classes that we ought to be creating. I've got real concern also about making sure that we're addressing all of our districts so that we have a program available in each of our 4 districts that, in coordination with the Assessors Association, that we can implement and have a high rate of success. When I was in the Senate, there was legislation that passed that created opportunities for 4-year degrees through community colleges. And I think it was 15 programs. There was a report recently by the LAO that 8 of those programs were not successful. They weren't reaching the goals that had been set through the legislation. And so I just want to make sure that whatever we create, that we have our ear to the ground in terms of what the need is for the county assessors, and that we're creating a program that is precise and fits the exact need for creating talented people that we can employ.
May I, Senator Gaines, I actually definitely am in agreement with you, and definitely want to acknowledge that part of this conversation is the Assessors Association. They, too, have taken some steps and have some resources and valid ideas about this pipeline that we're describing. Mr. Chair, I would strongly encourage us to take some action today, well, the work group's already been created, but let's convene it. I need you to call it, convene it, put a date down, so we can begin to work out those parameters that Senator Gaines talked about, make sure that we're soliciting and bringing in the feedback, and we're bringing together all the stakeholders, all the interested parties to this conversation as we move forward expeditiously to get this done.
I will take the responsibility of now hearing the consensus from our board here to get back to Jeff, as well as the Chancellor in LA County. And then as I see our chair here, Mr. Gayko, I will reach out to him and also get the information and contact from your person as well as Mr. Gaines, and see if we can't come up with a date that's convenient for all, and hopefully maybe pick a locale centrally located, because now we're talking about throughout the state. So, maybe pick an area, or we might even be able to do, pick somewhere where the majority of the folks are located, and then, now with teleconferencing,
Yes,
they
exactly,
have,
yes.
we can probably we have a pretty good system within our office down in our office too, so we could maybe set it up so we can do it via satellite.
Right,
or
people
something,
can call in.
just to make it convenient as possible, because it may be difficult to logistically getting everybody in the same room at the same time.
How's that sound, Mr. Don Gagel? Thumbs up?
Does that work?
Could we bring Don forward? Would it be possible?
Don,
Assessor Gagel?
let me have him come up real quick and at least share his thoughts on some of the other kinds. We kind of targeted LA County because it was the big one, and Jeff really is one that brought it to my attention that, he was telling me, he says, with or without split roll, we're in dire needs. And that's why we just kind of took it upon ourselves to run with that one. But
Oh, they've
let
displayed
me
a
hear
lot of
from
leadership.
the chair
Yeah,
and
we
see how
appreciate it.
the rest of the assessors
Yeah.
are doing.
Certainly, the Assessors Association would be happy to work with the board on that. I'd be happy to try and coordinate a date that we could all meet. Our Education Committee does a variety of things. Foremost, one of the best things they do is on the CASA and teaching classes for the non-appraisal staff, although certainly appraisers can do that. The Assessors Association has worked to create a number of courses in appraisal in the past. This would be a big lift, so I do think it's important to be part of the conversation, and if we can coordinate a date that works for all of us, that would be great.
I will take responsibility for that, and we'll get moving. Thank you.
Can I ask
Yes.
just a general question? Because, George, I thank you for your presentation, and I just keep thinking we're going to have to hire more than 1,000 folks. Now, statewide, because I know you're talking about property appraisers, but wouldn't there be, and both of you, if you could please answer, wouldn't there be additional staffing that would be required in your departments beyond just the property appraisers?
Yes.
In the event of passage of split roll?
Absolutely. So the focus today was on the appraiser training,
Yes.
so I did focus on the appraisers,
Yes.
and that number was about 500. Overall, in LA County, the total number is about 730.
Right,
So the proposal includes exclusions and exemptions, and this would take additional staff, plus, we would need additional administrative staff to hire, and, so even human resources, and throughout the department, there would be that need for expansion.
Okay. And Assessor Gagel?
Yeah, if I might say, there are a lot of things beyond the appraisers. And in fact, the smaller the county, the more appraisals there are going to be that properties that would qualify for exclusion from this on the $3 million thing. But that's a statewide issue, so there will be tremendous resources needed to coordinate statewide on total ownership value, and determining the $3 million exclusion. There'll also be a lot of work from title transfer departments in determining the makeup of ownership on commercial property to determine if it qualifies on that account. Certainly, also on the personal property exemption side, there's going to be a lot of research on trying to determine some of those same things, in addition to the number of employees that a business may have statewide. Those are going to be a lot of non-appraiser resources, but important resources nonetheless.
Okay.
I appreciate it. All right, with that, thank you for coming up. And I'll let Jeff know that you did a bang-up job up here,
Thank you.
and we'll take it from there.
Before they leave, could I?
Oh,
ask
you got a quick question?
Yeah. When did Mr. Prang decide he couldn't be with us today? I've been looking forward to seeing him. He's sort of a superstar.
I just heard from him yesterday. He's under the weather and regrets not being able to be here.
I thought maybe he had meetings all day with the governor or something.
No.
I sort of sense there's a little bit of Chicken Little, the sky is falling. I'm not as impressed as all of you folks are on the chances of split roll ever passing. The Voice of San Diego says that the polling for it is not very good, and he says that it's fatally flawed as a legal matter. As if it passes, nothing's going to happen. It hurts me to see so many important executives, including all of you and all of us, spend an awful lot of time trying to plan for the big boom, you know, and it may not happen. And I'm just trying to know, do we have any assessment? I mean, we all knew that Mr. Trump couldn't get elected president, but it happened, so we don't want to make any, hard and fast major decisions based on something that, you may be right and I may be wrong. I don't think it's that serious, although the consequences of it are major.
Mr. Chair, perhaps just in the interest of time, we could table that conversation for another day. It's not on the agenda, but we've got some guests here that we want to honor and acknowledge and keep this agenda moving forward.
Yeah, Member
Thank you.
Cohen is correct on that.
Thank you.
I have nothing further to say. I just was interested. And let me add, finally, in the assessment, do you have to go out and physically see the properties in each and every case like we did 50 years ago? I know now you can go online and you can get all kinds of photographs of any particular property from all sides, that you might be able to do your work much more efficiently without having to physically go to the sites.
In the case of commercial industrial properties, which is the topic of discussion, it is typically necessary to go out and view the property, and then there's also an extensive amount of data collection that's involved in that type of appraisal. So it is, the commercial industrial is more time-consuming.
Yeah, it's a major undertaking. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, Ms. Davis, I think we need to go back to L1, because I understand Lizette Mata is here. Oh, I see her right there. If she would come up. Folks, I was contacted, and I think maybe several other members were also by our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, to see if we could weigh in as constitutional officers to talk about the census. And, I understand 10 years ago, this board and other constitutional officers in the state of California got involved because with an accurate count, I think it helps all of us, whatever field we're in, whether we're in affordable housing, education, healthcare, taxes, it all has an impact. And we're lucky to have a representative here from the deputy from the Secretary of State, Lizette Mata, to give us her presentation and then also to talk about what other constitutional officers are doing in the state of California.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, you need to call
Just for
the
the
item.
record, let me just call the
Yes.
item.
I jumped ahead of you then, Ms. Davis, go ahead.
Our next item is L1, California Complete Count 2020 Census, presented by Chairman Vasquez. There's also a speaker, Ms. Lizette Mata, Deputy Secretary of State Operations. She is here to present. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Vasquez and Board of Equalization members, for the opportunity to present on a critical project for all of us, the 2020 census. It's been about 9 months since Governor Gavin Newsom announced his appointment of Secretary Padilla as chair of the California Complete Count Committee, and we are less than 2 months away from the count, which begins in mid-March. It is very rare when members from all parties agree about any specific issue, but the census is so important, it will require an all-hands-on-deck approach from every single one of us. Today, I am here to invite you to join our efforts as fellow constitutional offices to ensure that every Californian is counted. We each have a role to play as we all have different constituents we serve. Together, we can all be that much more effective in ensuring everyone is counted. And we are not here just to make requests or to extend invitations. Secretary Padilla has chosen to lead by example. I would like to share that in anticipation of the census, the Secretary of State's office has been working closely with the California Census team and has been sharing best practices on what we did in the last election related to misinformation, disinformation, and how we worked with federal organizations and social media platforms to ensure we had an effective partnership. Clearly, it has been a good opportunity for our office to prepare for the next election, which is also around the corner for us. We are also proud to share that on November 19th, 2019, the Secretary of State's office released a statewide voter information guide for public review, and it included 2 information pages on the census, one related to the Census Bill of Rights, and the other was a page that we worked with the California Census team and includes key timelines related to the census. This voter information guide will reach up to 15 million people, and it will be translated into 10 languages. These are only a couple of the quick highlights of our overall strategy. My presentation will walk you through a little bit more of the structure and organization of how you can receive assistance from the California Census team and how you can start connecting to the community organizations in your area that are laying the groundwork for successful census outreach strategy. And with that, I'd like to bring your attention to the slides in front of you. So what is the census? The U.S. Constitution requires an accurate count of every person living in the United States every 10 years. The next census is in 2020 and asks questions that provide a snapshot of the nation and will determine how more than $675 billion in federal funding is distributed to states and communities each year. Census results affect your voice in government, how much funding your community receives, and how your community plans for the future. For every Californian missed during the Census 2020 count, the state is expected to lose approximately $1,000 per person per year for 10 years in federal program funding. California leaders have invested a total of $187 million to ensure an accurate count. That is an unprecedented level of funding from the governor and the legislature. So why is the Census 2020 important? So as you can see, here's a couple of the highlights. It's about fair representation. It's our civic duty. It's about redistricting. And it's also about data collection for all of this, for the federal government as well as the state. It also ensures that it allows us to advocate for more resources for community members, it ensures public safety, and helps plan new schools and hospital locations. And it just helps us decide where to open companies and businesses which help create jobs. This is also very important. I'd like to share and make sure that everybody understands, because this is a question that we've been receiving. By law, the U.S. Census Bureau cannot share the data with immigration or law enforcement agencies or allow it to determine eligibility for government benefits. So this is I wanted to make sure we walked you through under the California Complete Count State Census Office. A lot of people hear census and they don't realize the magnitude and the complexity of how this organization is operating, because there's different layers. And so the very first layer that I would like to discuss with you is the California Census team that is based here in California. It is an entity, an organization of appointees appointed by beginning Governor Edmund G. Brown and then now Governor Gavin Newsom. And it has divided the state into 10 regions and assigned a state census staffer to each region to collaborate and coordinate with unique hard-to-count communities in that area. This regional management structure is core to the outreach team's ability to establish and coordinate local relationships and effectively manage contracts. Since this slide was put together, there were at least 24 statewide readiness assessment regional convenings that began in 2018. It also, the California Census team launched the California Complete Count Committee, which met on a quarterly basis to advise and inform the state census staff. It also updated the state legislature and the governor's office with quarterly reports that are public and online, documenting progress of the state's campaign. It also coordinated 3 tribal government consultations in Northern, Central, and Southern California. And it also conducted county kickoff orientations to brief the counties or their contractual obligations and facilitate any questions. So due to ADA, one of the things that we weren't able to give you, but you will be able to find online on the website for the California Census team, is one of the slides for the funding for 10 regions. This is important because, as you know, there was approximately $187 million on the table. Many of you represent these areas. So I can guarantee you there's at least 1 to possibly 2, maybe even 3 regional ACBOs of the 10 that you could directly communicate with now. And that's something that we can help facilitate, and we can certainly be your liaison and ensure that you have those communications and connections directly to your organizations. It's also important that you know and can be appraised of all of the highlights of what is happening, and since it's been happening on a quarterly basis in terms of reports, you will be able to receive the most updated information on the California Census webpage. So as you can see, those are the 10 structures on the slides. Those are the 10 regions. And so that's what I was meaning, that you might fall in a midsection of at least 1 to 2, maybe even 3 of those regions. So next slide. So the next slide, so this is the California Count Committee members. So this is the second entity. So the first one was the actual administrative body that is doing all of the work. It has all of the organization entity. It has all of the staffing that was appointed. This is another arm that works directly with the California Census team. And we advise the California Census team on recommendations, including misinformation, outreach strategies, and how to communicate with constituents. We don't oversee the budget. We don't oversee any of the actual decisions that are made, but we've been advising since the secretary came on board in May and since he was appointed. So this is the list of the Complete Count Committee members. It is a member that has been appointed from at least, what the governors did was they looked at different issue areas that needed to be highlighted, whether it was LGBT communities, Latino communities, African American communities. They looked at the critical needs and targeted areas that really needed to make sure we had a voice and be counted. And those were the people that have been appointed in the California Complete Count Committee. And that is the committee that the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, chairs. So that is why we're in the picture. Most people ask, what is your role, what is your responsibility? And that is the role and the arm that we oversee.
Perhaps you said this in your presentation, I might have missed it, but the California Complete Count Committee, how were those members selected? Did they apply? Were they appointed? What was the process?
They applied and they were appointed by Governor Brown, and recently about 5 were appointed about 2 months ago by Governor Gavin Newsom. So they are governor's appointees.
Okay.
And even Secretary of State Alex Padilla is a governor's appointee to this.
So when you say people applied, where did they apply?
It was on the governor's appointment page.
Okay.
So it was listed there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what is the Secretary of State's office doing for census outreach? So some of the things that we've been working on with different organizations is the digital online. So we put it into different buckets, and this is what you may have seen in our call to action when we asked originally for your partnership. This was some of the work that we're doing is making sure that we have a digital and online presence by creating fact sheets for the top 25 hardest to count counties, which are posted on our website and social media platforms. We've also created an easily accessible census webpage on the Secretary of State's website, which includes helpful resources and a video PSA from the Secretary. And we've also helped in disseminating information regarding the census to all census employees via our digital newsletter and reminders via agency emails. We have also, in terms of physical locations and spaces, have promoted the census in high-traffic locations of our agency, including the main library, lobby, and the California Museum. And many community-based organizations have created content which we have been able to display. If you would like help in connecting with some of these specific organizations, again, we can certainly help make those introductions. And I really wanted to make sure we highlighted this work because this is a part of our commitments and what we've done as the chief of the operations for our agency. We understand that there's a lot of budget constraint. We understand that there's resources constraints, right? We know that our staff is already at max capacity, especially because we're overseeing the March primary that's happening in a couple of months, as well as the election. So we have a lot on our plate as well. And what we wanted to do is to add as much as we could without just reinventing the wheel. So we already know we have to do a voter information guide. We included that content in the guide. We all already know that normally every other month we update our posters in our elevators. Those are some of the things that we've chosen to do. And the newsletter, I know that each one of you might have some sort of a newsletter or a way that you can communicate with your constituents. Even sending a letter for us, like reminding our businesses about the census, is something that doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't cost a lot of money, but it really does make sure that this is a presence for your constituents, of making sure that the reminder of the census is prominent. Some of the other things that we have done for our services and programs, as I've mentioned, is include census information about the Census Bill of Rights in the Voter Information Guide. We have also added information to our California State Archives, which is publishing an online Google exhibit on the census. So that should be coming out in the next few weeks. We've also started to work on outreach and events, which to help promote the census and ensuring that we have talking points in the presentations that the secretary makes related to ensuring that students know when to register to vote. So we also have we also make sure that we weave in information about the importance of civic engagement, and that includes the census. The secretary has attended California Complete Count Committee hearings throughout the state. So since he became chair, he's attended at least one in each region. And we have made a commitment. The next Complete Count Committee hearing is scheduled to be in the Bay. So we held one in Sacramento, we held one in Los Angeles, the last one was in Fresno, and now we're heading to the Bay. And
what are those dates?
The next Complete Count Committee hearing is scheduled tentatively because I need to make sure we get this invitation out, and I'm trying to secure our venue, is scheduled for February 27th. And I know that that is the area that you represent, so I'm happy to make sure that we put that on your radar.
He read my mind.
I know where you were going. So that is really the two arms that I wanted to make sure we walked you through. Most people don't understand what our role is as Secretary of State's office. We work in partnership with the California Census team. We can make sure that you have a liaison. We've already created that structure with the California Census team. And then you can work directly with your community organizations. And then beyond those two entities, which are California-focused, we also have another layer, which is the Federal Census Bureau. Most people also mention the Federal Census Bureau. They work in partnership. They provide a lot of the guidelines. They also help support with outreach and media. And so that's why it really is an all-hands-on-deck approach. There's different layers. And so hopefully I didn't confuse you more, but I provided some clarity as to the way that the census is working and operating. And with that, I will go ahead and close my presentation. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but as long as we continue to close gaps and work together, we will ensure that California is counted. Thank you for the invitation to join you today, and I am here if you have any questions.
Thank you. I have just one quick one, then I'll open it up to the members. I think you kind of touched on it, but because I know Secretary of State is real involved with it, and I actually bumped into him last night at a reception, and he was actually flying into LA. I don't know if it was census related, but in any event, I know he's all up and down the state on this issue. What are some of the other constitutional officers doing to complement what the Secretary is doing?
So I'm still having conversations with the Insurance Commissioner's office. The superintendent, actually, or the superintendent's
State.
office of the state,
Yeah.
his office has actually been working on this, and one of the things that, they have a fantastic plan. So they have been reaching out to their offices of education, in particular the hard-to-count communities like the migrant education programs, and working directly at the local level with them, sending out reminders, sending out letters to ensure that people participate and are reminded. There's also different work at the local level, so they have sent out the communication and the reminders, and then at the local level, there's different regions that are doing different things. So I'm here today because this is actually the first presentation that I will be having. In the next few weeks, I anticipate doing a couple of more meetings and presentations with the other constitutional officers. But it's our hope that by February 27th, hopefully, by the next Complete Count Committee hearing, we can provide an update and a calendar of all of the things and the roadmap of all of the constitutional offices are working on. And each one has made a commitment to do something, and they've been working internally since we put out the call. And so I'll be checking in. This is my first stop. So hopefully by February 27th, I will have a better update.
And I'm assuming you have a lot of the printed material already that's available. So at minimum, I'm just thinking, and I shared this with our executive director, that, we should be able to have that information at least at all our offices, on our tables, our information areas where people could actually just pick it up, or posters and that kind of stuff as well.
The California Census team has finalized the look and feel and a brand for this for a collateral campaign. And so they definitely have material that you can access. They also have on the immediate end, in case we need to send any information to your districts or to your offices, which may take a little bit of time. On the immediate end, they have social media toolkits. The most current one, which was updated in January 2020, that we can get to your offices as early as in the next couple of hours. I can make sure that you have that, and your communications team or your offices can start figuring out what they can integrate with related to the census.
I appreciate it.
Chair,
Mr. Schiff?
is there a website you might refer us to?
Yes.
U.S. Census 2020 or something simple?
So it's census.ca.gov.
Census.
Census.ca.gov.
Mr. Gaines?
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mata. Appreciate the presentation. And I'm trying to get some clarity, if I could, from Mr. Nanjo in terms of our ability to communicate. This is kind of the outreach. I know we talk about outreach and education. So can you provide some clarity, given AB 102, in terms of what we can and cannot do?
So given AB 102, the agency is a little bit limited because we need to concentrate on, obviously, tax collecting and revenue functions. But from the board member standpoint, this is part of your duty as a constitutional officer. So to the extent that you can share materials, or if you want to do anything, with your own staff, that's perfectly appropriate.
Okay.
And
Could
if
we
they're-
send out a communication?
Sure, that's fine.
Emails, things like that?
Yeah, that would be appropriate, because as a constitutional officer, it behooves all of the state of California to participate and get as complete a count as possible, and that's a nonpartisan, function, so.
Letters?
That's fine. Yeah.
Because on some issues, we have a
mayors?
200-letter limit on certain things, don't we, in terms of how we
Yes,
communicate?
that's your
So-
mass mailing rules. All those rules apply, but from the standpoint of, again, the only firewall that you have to be careful about is using agency funds or agency staff, but to the extent that you're using your own board members' offices and staff, that's fine.
Okay, very
Okay.
well.
But
Yeah, that's
obviously,
helpful.
please pay attention to mass mailing rules, et cetera, et cetera.
Right,
So, And if
absolutely.
you have
Great.
specific questions, I'm more than happy to answer them one-on-one.
Great, thank you. I had read that California may lose a congressional seat because of the changing populations nationally compared to California. Do you have any further information on that, or?
We are hearing the same reports. It's been a concern of, I believe, the legislature and the governor for the last year and a half or so. I think that is why they had an unprecedented level of funding associated with outreach and communication efforts statewide. And so this is, I also believe that's one of the reasons why the secretary has made it a top priority for our office as well, because of the risk. So we certainly understand it, and it is a very real risk. And we will require every office, and we're hoping that everyone will be able to partner and assist in these efforts.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mata, fantastic presentation. I appreciate the information that you've brought to us. Please give the Secretary our regards. I am looking for real tangible ways to be helpful. I think it was late last year I received a social media toolkit about standing up, being counted. I'm looking for ways that we can go back into our constituencies. You see, represented up here are 4 seats, but we represent about 40 million people. Each one of us represent 10 million people. I represent 23 counties. So how do we begin to assist you in this journey and getting the word out? I'm particularly interested when we're talking about communities of color, communities where English is spoken as a second language, where there's real fear about the census and fear about being counted. How do we begin? Do you have language or tools or things to help us massage our community members, to relax them? And are there action items that you have for us to carry out on behalf of this endeavor?
Absolutely. So absolutely critical concern. So one of the things that I really appreciate about this census effort is that the state has really placed the majority of the workload and the creation of the content on the communities themselves. So within your area, there are community organizations who've already had their plans approved, communication and toolkits that are related to specifically their issues that have been vetted by their own community members. So the administrative community-based organization is the ACBO within the California Census team. Depending on which areas you serve, I can work with you and your teams. Let me know what areas in particular. I can look at your maps and I can give you exactly who your ACBOs are.
Okay.
I can place you in communication, and they are the best at being able to develop and share the content that they already have. Many of them have PSAs, videos. They have events that they're finalizing. I'm working through and calling through our ACBOs and our partners and trying to get a better sense of the calendar for the next few weeks. And most of them are still in the process of finalizing those details. So I can give you at least a tentative schedule of what those will look like so that you have them on your radar. But in addition to that, the first and most important a step would be to place you in communication with the ACBO so
And what
that you know
does
exactly.
ACBO stand for?
The Administrative Community-Based Organization.
Okay.
So each of the 10 regions, as I mentioned, is the lead of community-based organizations is the ACBO, the Administrative Community-Based Organization. They have been selected to be able to manage all of the funding associated, and that has been allocated by the state.
And when does the census kick off?
So we anticipate that, and we will be sharing that in the next, the legislature is actually finalizing those details. We will be having a kickoff in Sacramento in the next few weeks, but I would have to get back to you on that.
Okay, got it.
I believe it's April Fool's Day.
That's one of the dates. That's certainly one of the dates, and but I believe there's actually an event that the legislature is working on.
Okay.
I can get you more details.
Okay, great, thank you. I have no other questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you for coming up.
Thank you.
All right, I was informed that we need to take at least a 10-minute break here for the recorder, and then we'll move on to our next item after. If we could just take a 10-minute break, and we'll be right back. Get everybody seated. We'll go ahead and reconvene.
Where are they?
It looks like we have a quorum sit, now we're good. I will call the meeting back to order. Ms. Davis, if you can call the next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next item is L4, public testimony on property tax exemptions to spur affordable housing development in California, Part 2. This item was introduced by Member Cohen. We have 2 speakers. of the Honorable Mayor Steinberg of the City of Sacramento and Richard Lyon, Senior Consultant, California Building Industry Association.
So, Ms. Cohen, you want to open her up, or you want me to give you, I think we've talked about it a couple times, but I'm glad that you've taken the leadership to bring a couple more speakers to kind of bring us
Yes.
up to speed on this issue.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will take it over here from here. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I appreciate you hearing the call and responding. I think that's rule number one when it comes to public service. So I'm grateful for your time, and it's important for us to have this conversation. As you know, the issue of affordable housing has plagued our entire state for decades, and we are getting together and starting to move in a more thoughtful direction on how do we solve our problem. I don't know if the answer is SB 50. I don't know if the answer is more affordable housing, less affordable housing. We're here to really have the conversation. I tend to believe that it's more affordable housing. But here at the Board of Equalization, we're primarily focused on property tax, the assessment of property tax. So we set the rules, the parameters, the guidelines. We give legal opinions to the 58 county assessors. And we, the Board of Equalization, assess $6.5 trillion in property across the entire state of California. That accounts to about 13 million individual assessments, and also brings in about $70 billion. So that's a pretty decent chunk of change. And so today you're going to be giving us testimony to, and give us your thoughts on, as we begin to review the property tax exemptions. I'm particularly going to be listening to your ideas about how we can spur affordable housing development, how we can further incentivize and spur more affordable housing development. Now, you two are leading experts in this area, that's just why you're here. And so I just want to conclude my remarks and go ahead and jump in and allow you, Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here. And Mr. Lyon, again, I'm grateful for your time and for you being here as well. Mr. Mayor, we'll start with you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much, Member Cohen and Chairman Vasquez, members of the board. It's an honor to be here. I don't know that I've ever had the opportunity to present before the State Board of Equalization. So thank you for the opportunity. And I appreciated your introduction describing me as an expert, but I will deny that under oath, because I don't know that I am, but I certainly have had a number of years, both serving at the state level and at the local level, where I have seen this housing crisis in its various forms and the various efforts to address it. And I will say on the good side here, if there is a good side, I think housing is finally having its day. It's a matter of public policy in California. I think for a long time, it was hard to have a real public policy conversation that at a high level that was a priority around housing. Most of the infrastructure debates we had in the legislature when I served with Senator Gaines, largely I would say around transportation. We did a housing bond here and there. I did SB 375, and there were some important efforts, but we're finally at a time now, maybe because of the crisis, that which might not have seemed possible before is now possible today. And I think I commend you for, asking the question, how can you use your authority as the Board of Equalization to help incentivize desperately needed affordable housing? So a couple of thoughts and comments. There is no one solution, obviously. Some of it is the regulatory environment and this tension between the drive to produce more housing and local control. You see that being played out now in the SB 50 debate. Some of it is state regulation and the ability to stop a good project using a variety of tools. Some of it is money, obviously. But some of it is also, in my opinion, our own, what I would call calcification around how we do the housing business in California. And I'd cite this example, and it really strikes home for me as the mayor of my city. our latest RENA numbers show that we have the need to build about 60,000 new units of workforce and affordable housing in the greater Sacramento area over the next 7 years. And we are, I think, doing our part to bring forward new resources. We passed a sales tax increase in November of 2016. Tonight at the City Council at 5 o'clock, we're going to take up my proposal to securitize a portion of that to create an affordable housing bond so that we have skin in the game to be able to match the private sector and do more. But the math problem that I'm stuck with is the fact that in Sacramento, a, quote, low-cost area of the state, it requires an average of $300,000 to $400,000 of public subsidy to build a single unit of affordable housing or permanent supportive housing. And to me, it's a simple math problem. That's great for the people who benefit, whether they be the homeless people, the extremely low-income people, people moving up from substandard housing. That's all good and great, of course. But we will never get to the volume that we need to meet the demand and the need for the unsheltered homeless, for those living on the edge, for those who are housed but are one paycheck away. I guess that's the living on the edge, or one unanticipated medical problem, broken down car away from ending up on the streets. And so what are we doing as a state to actually incentivize different prototypes? And here's what I mean by that. I've stood outside of City Hall and seen fabulous demonstrations around pallet homes, efficiency homes, cargo units, tiny homes, cabin communities, and every one that I have seen has been high quality, have included all the things that would come under the umbrella of safety and dignity: electricity, plumbing, insulation, safety. And all of them can be constructed for significantly less than the $300,000 to $400,000 of public subsidy that is required to build a conventional apartment or condominium. And yet, I leave those demonstrations both excited and wondering, why has there not, in this state of great innovation, the Silicon Valley, has there not been a market produced? Why hasn't there been a Silicon Valley moment around quality, efficiency housing? And so I say to you that whether it be your property tax abatement opportunity through state legislation, whether or not you might be the leaders in constructing a public policy that would provide a real financial incentive to these burgeoning industries around manufactured housing, cheaper to build, faster to build, high quality, but smaller units, and to start putting some real resources into different prototypes that we so desperately need in California. Tonight, I'm proposing that 30% of our $100 million housing trust fund be set aside for efficiency housing, and specifically we say 30% can only be used for housing which requires a subsidy of no greater than $100,000. That may or may not be the right number. I'm not exactly sure, but the idea is we will never meet the volume if we only have one way of doing things. So I think there's a desperate need for more innovation. And of course, it's not just the money, but the laws, both the state laws and the local zoning and regulatory laws also need to support this kind of innovation in the housing world. And we often don't. We often have restrictive parking requirements or other impediments to trying to do something out of the proverbial box. And so I know I'm doing this long enough where I get, and you know my politics, right? I'm maybe a little different from Senator Gaines in terms of my own politics here. But I'm actually kind of tired of we need more money and we would solve the problem. I'm for more money, always. But only if it is matched with a smarter way and a different way of doing things. And I see it now more as the mayor maybe than I ever did as the state Senate pro tem, because I've got 50 some odd thousand units that I have to at least get started in building beginning now over the next 7 to 8 years. There are so many other things I could and would talk about, including I do want to make a pitch for one other idea. Governor Newsom asked me to chair his homeless task force, co-chair with Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas. And we put out a very provocative idea, namely that housing the unsheltered homeless, and by the way, this could apply to, in a broader way, but certainly among the unsheltered homeless, bringing people indoors can no longer be a governmental option. It has to be a mandate. And we all should be accountable for reducing the unsheltered homeless population by aggressive but reasonable benchmarks over aggressive but reasonable periods of time. Because unless we are mandated to do what the public is crying for and what our consciences should cry for, we're never going to consolidate the resources we have. We're never going to work with more dispatch, more urgency, more collaboratively across jurisdiction lines to actually hit a standard that we all desperately want and need to achieve. So we're looking to work with the administration and the legislature to actually put in the Constitution a requirement that the state, counties, and the cities all be held accountable, again, to aggressive but reasonable benchmarks, and give a court, God forbid, the authority to require a non-compliant jurisdiction to do what they have to do to get the money out and to work more effectively to actually begin to reduce the scope of this problem. And so it's about money, it's about how we spend the money, it's about optionality versus a requirement, and it is about making it easier for those who actually build the housing to be able to do so. Be glad to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we want to hear from the next speaker before we go?
Absolutely.
Then we'll go on to questions.
Yes. Mr. Lyon.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair and members. It's a pleasure to be here, and certainly is a pleasure to share the stage with Mayor Steinberg, Senator Steinberg. We have worked together for many years on a number of issues, transportation and housing. The Senator had mentioned Senate Bill 375 that tries to better link transportation and housing to achieve our climate goals, and that was a key piece of legislation that the Senator authored and that I had the pleasure of working on, and we continued to see it operate throughout the regions in California. And I would say I think we're doing a much better job than we have in the past on trying to be more efficient in the way we use land, the way we link with transportation improvements, and certainly trying to address our climate issues. The mayor talked about no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, but it's exactly what the mayor talked about. It is an all-the-above strategy. I think I probably should start by, some of you may not know who the California building industry is. The members of CBIA, the men, women, and companies, produce probably about 75% of the residential product in California for sale, for rent. They build in urban areas, they build in suburban areas, they build high density, they build low density. So we are an organization that is dedicated to providing shelter for California residents. I represented the home building industry for close to 30 years, so I was in the pivot for that amount of time on the key issues over the last 30 years that have involved housing and all of those issues that are involved in what it takes to not only get housing approved, but also build communities. Our members don't just build housing, they build communities. So I'd say that history and experience suggest, big picture, that asset acquisition and home ownership particularly is foundational to the ability of individuals and families to acquire a measure of wealth and to scale the economic ladder. So as we talk about policies that support and sustain home ownership, they're critically important. They must be taken seriously because they impact the entire community, and they can assist in helping to alleviate the problems that are key in California today, particularly problems of wealth disparity. So the general question that is before us today is, are property tax exemptions an effective strategy in spurring housing development in California? And I think the answer is yes, but it's a qualified yes. As a general principle, residential investment is responsive to the property tax. The more favorable the policy, the more likely that investment will occur and that supply will increase. And so in most normal, elastic, and open markets, an appropriately structured policy can encourage the production of new units. That can increase the need for new business amenities. That can make neighborhoods more desirable, improve rents, and generally enhance the overall quality of life in a community. So there is a role, certainly, for strategies that involve property tax and using that in a strategic way. So I say under most normal circumstances it works. There's nothing normal as we sit here today about California's housing catastrophe. It has been long in the making. It's compounded negatively over the years. So it is really not feasible, either politically or economically, to believe that we can just subsidize our way out of the problem or we can just build our way out of the problem. If we're going to see real progress, we need to package targeted strategies around the use of our fiscal tools with a broader set of policies that facilitate private, single-family, and multifamily construction. So if we combine that with affordable housing strategies, then this all-the-above strategy can help us move to a healthier housing picture in California. So things like traditional housing bond and tax credit programs, and I would say property tax exemptions probably fall into this category, are helpful, but they only go so far, and they only account, as we sit here today, for a small slice of the total units that are built each year in California. Now, I'm like the mayor. I see the glass as half full. I've always been an optimist. You have to be an optimist to do what I did for nearly 30 years in the California legislature. But in terms of the cost effectiveness of ad valorem exemptions, they're going to be challenging to implement because of the complexity of the California state, local education finance realities. That's something that we have to consider. So depending upon how many properties might be eligible for an exemption, we will have to deal with issues about local property tax losses. We'll have to deal with state general fund backfilling to comply with Prop 98 education obligations. So those are going to be matters that are going to have to be considered as we look at, or as you look at, using your fiscal ability to try to stimulate housing construction and provide particularly for the most vulnerable in our community. Again, this isn't to say that exemptions shouldn't be on the table for discussion. They absolutely should, but they have to be more of a comprehensive approach if we're going to lift all boats and if we're going to make a real difference. So I'll throw out some ideas that I think are kind of all boat lifting, and then I'll put something on the table that we can kind of kick around. But if we're looking at big picture, trying to use all of the tools we have in California, land supply is absolutely critical to the ability to provide housing. So we need to see a sufficient supply of land to meet our current and future needs. The land may be situated in transit-rich areas. It may be fallow or in underutilized land in urban areas where it's not proximate to transit. It may be in areas where the regional footprint makes sense to grow to accommodate future job centers and economic activity. I referenced Mayor Steinberg's bill, SB 375. That is a regional approach to accommodating housing combined with the regional transportation network. So the framework is already in place and is being utilized by communities to look broader than just the boundaries of a neighborhood or a city or an area. We're looking at a regional scale now, and so in order to make it work, we have to have a sufficient supply of land in the various areas where the markets are trying to penetrate in order to be able to make housing feasible. Forming new state-local government partnerships to advance affordable housing investment and to finance the infrastructure that's necessary for overall increased housing production will be key if communities are going to meet their regional goals, if they're going to meet their climate goals, and if they're going to meet their economic development goals. Some may call this redevelopment 2.0. Redevelopment kind of carries a scarlet letter. I'm not talking about redevelopment coming back, but we need to look at using the existing tools we have and improving on how we partnership with communities and looking to bring the state back in as a financing partner so that we can provide the infrastructure and the subsidy for the below market rate housing that is so critically needed if we're going to meet these fabulous housing goals that we've got set out over the next couple decades. The regional housing needs assessment process should be rethought. We should base compliance on, I think Senator would agree with this, on the number of units built and focus where those units go more where the regional workforce exists or where it's projected to expand to. And then lawsuits that use environmental laws should focus on real environmental issues, and once the deficiencies have been corrected, the project should be able to move forward. So those are kind of big picture ideas, strategies that we need to use. Back to, what specific ideas can we put on the table? Discretionary development impact fees and surface fees make up a significant percentage of the cost of building new units in California. There was a recent survey by the Turner Center, and they found that fees for multifamily housing can range from anywhere from $12,000 to $86,000 a unit. But that doesn't tell the whole story at all, because that particular survey was limited to charges that were authorized under the Subdivision Map Act. The actual cost in terms of fees and impositions to housing is significantly higher. For example, school fees were not authorized under the Subdivision Map Act. They were authorized under the Education Code. They can add in a growing area $10,000 to $15,000 per unit, depending upon the school district. And because consumers of new housing bear the cost of those fees, I would argue that they're equivalent to a prepaid or upfront property tax. And so I think, and to the extent that those property taxes on a broader scale also finance infrastructure that's used by existing residents, there are issues of fairness that are presented in terms of what individuals and families coming into and buying a new home in a new area are charged, and what individuals who are already here, the incumbent class, are charged and who benefits from each. So we look at the total fee component of new residential construction, and there might be some opportunities to look at ways to deduct that from property tax or to exempt it entirely from as a component of our property tax requirements. I'm not an expert in property tax law. I'm kind of getting out over my skis here, but the point is this, that one of the impediments and drivers of the high cost of housing, in addition to land, in addition to entitlements, to litigation, and to a long entitlement process, are the fees that go into the construction and the mitigation of a variety of issues of new housing. And there might be ways we can look at to capture that and offer those as a deductive benefit to new home buyers.
May I jump in? I just want to acknowledge, I think the mayor's going to have to be departing soon, but one of the things that you both said that I thought was interesting is that you pointed out that any property tax exemption or abatement potentially could have a negative impact on local funding. You don't know very much about me, but I spent 8 years on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, where I was also president of the body and spent about 6 years chairing the Land Use Committee. And so when you're talking about construction fees, mitigation fees, impact fees, that's also often a tool that communities use to support, it's a vehicle used to support a project that would mitigate the impact of the changing community, like gentrification, for example. So maybe you could talk to me a little bit about the construction fees, mitigation fees that you were just mentioning. I assume what I'm hearing is relaxing them is what you're proposing.
Oh, yes. I mean, I wouldn't sit here and argue that new home buyers or the development community shouldn't pay its own way. We have cleared that hurdle decades ago. We're very comfortable paying our own way. What I think I'm saying is that we've gotten to a point with the state local education finance picture in California that it's easy to seize on the new individuals or potential new individuals coming into a community and say, okay, we've got these existing problems. We can't go to existing residents, or there's only so much we can demand from the existing property tax rolls, from the existing sales tax rolls. So we're going to look to you, new residents, to solve these long-standing problems that we have in our community. It's easy to do, and it has been used and abused, and it's one of the reasons that we see fees getting to be so high on new residential construction.
Thank you, Mr. Lyon. Mr. Mayor, I have a question for you. Do you believe that we are at a time where we should seriously consider property tax abatement and property tax exemptions, reconsidering them? Do you think that even if it means it has, even if it has a negative impact on the local economy, when I say the economy, I mean really like your local government. I mean, their impact fees go into your city.
My answer would be yes.
Okay.
Subject to the details. And I would define the details in this way. How is the money going to be spent? What is the tax return to the local community? Because we're doing that in a different way now, right? We're establishing our housing trust fund by taking some of our general fund sales tax, which we did increase to 1 cent as a general tax. And as mayor, I said I want to use the money for housing, but it's the general fund. We're using the taxpayer dollar to do just that. A property tax abatement might cost us money, but if it were going into the same, if it were actually enhancing our economic base by providing more housing, I think we'd have to be open to it. But we have to be analytical about it, because we're all dancing around the same question, which is who pays?
Right.
Who does pay? the development community will say the more fees you impose on them, the less of the less of an opportunity they have to build housing, especially low and very low income housing. The public, the cities would say, well, don't take it directly from us because the developers want to build housing only in communities where you have sufficient public safety and good parks.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is really centered around the dysfunction of our overall finance system and the fact that the property tax became, devolved to the locals with obvious significant limitations. So yes, I would be open to that, so long as, and I think what cities would say, as long as we can model an actual return to our cities, because property tax, there are other recipients of property tax as well, directly or indirectly, right? Whether, as Richard said, whether it's the schools, whether it's the counties, whether it's the states directly. And I think that we're all looking for incentives for the public and private sector to be able to do more.
Along
So
those
yes, I'd
lines-
be open to it.
Along those lines, Mayor, before you leave, what's your thoughts and ideas on terms of inclusionary housing? I know some cities have been pushing that, throughout the state, but I know others have been kind of pushed back and fighting or resisting it.
I mean, I've always been for inclusionary housing. It's a tough sell in many communities, but I think it not only is another tool to enhance affordability, but I also think it integrates our communities in very real ways by, not just by race and ethnicity, but people at different income levels, I think should be living together as opposed to people being segregated, in a de facto way by class. But let me step back and answer it a different way. You know what's missing from the whole discussion, and Richard alluded to it, and we alluded to it very heavily in our homeless task force report. There is no production standard in California. There's no production standard. Our standard is a planning standard. It's and the recourse is to file a civil lawsuit against a jurisdiction, which is expensive and time-consuming in order to assure they comply with the planning requirement of the law. There's no production requirement. And it's true that there are some things out of local government's control, but I say this as a mayor, where I'm supposed to be, leave us alone, don't impose any more accountability, responsibility on us. I don't agree with that. I think there should be a production standard. We should all be driving towards production. And by the way, that would enhance the kind of innovation that I spoke about earlier, because everything we're talking about now is inductive as opposed to deductive. There's no standard, which would be the umbrella that we're all feeding the strategies into trying to reach a goal. Instead, everything is bottom up. Property tax abatement, fee relief, zoning changes, and we're all hoping that the combination of these things is going to actually change the equation, as opposed to saying, it was hard, you, city, county, state, are mandated to meet a production standard. And we're going to hold you accountable to it in some real way, not in a punitive way, but in some real way. And I think, like renewable energy, this is my great analogy. We didn't say to the energy world, please volunteer to substitute out your fossil fuels for renewable energy and report back to us whenever you can and let us know how you're doing. We didn't say that. We've established a renewable energy mandate. And by the way, we didn't tell local air districts or the energy world how to meet it. That's local control. But we said we expect you to meet the percentage. And it sent a market signal that is actually leading towards our ever-increasing percentages towards a renewable energy future. We don't do that with housing. We don't do that with homelessness. We try to apply all the best policies and hope for the best. I mean, at some level, to me, housing's a human and civil right, but it's not treated that way. And I think it's because we don't send that market signal that we require what we all know is necessary. Now, a mandate cannot be unreasonable or pie in the sky, but if Governor Newsom says 350,000 units over X number of years, why aren't we setting the benchmarks to at least begin trying to get there? And I think that's missing, and some of that's about political will, societal will. If it's important enough, we say it must be so. Public education, we don't say it's an option to educate third graders. It's an option to house people. I'm sorry. That's where it begins, and our finance system and our regulatory system all sort of limps along, as we have this terrible crisis. I'm not saying accountability is everything, but I just think we're not setting the public policy. So again, if you were to do property tax abatement, bring it back to you, I would focus it on a very specific objective, not just to give the money away and hope for the result, but to provide it after the fact, after an objective has been met. And it ought to be based on production of some kind, not on planning and not on a hope for result.
Thank you.
Mr. Gaines on this end had a quick question.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Mr. Gaines, what his thinking is. Hear his thoughts.
I appreciate, Mayor Steinberg, you being here and providing really good information. And something I really worry about is the ability of millennials to buy a home in California, and you.
Or to be able to rent an apartment.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I like home ownership because it builds equity and it gives someone a nest egg, right? So it can be supplemental income to them. And I know some folks can't afford it, and we need to make sure we have a balanced housing opportunities for folks, whether it's renting or buying. But you brought up an example, a $50,000 mini home. But the question is, how do you create that sort of development project? And then what is the fee structure for something that might be 500 square feet versus a 2,000 square foot home? So do you have proportionality in terms of the fee structure?
You should have proportionality.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
But this answer might surprise you, my friend, Member Gaines here, but I think we ought to unleash the private sector to figure out how to create these new industries. I just think it's our job as government to both ensure the regulatory environment, but also I think money matters. I think the public sector has some skin in the game. Then we can spark a new set of industries. But right now we have one prototype, and it's for affordable housing and permanent supportive housing, and it's in Los Angeles or San Francisco. It can come close to $1 million a unit. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Right.
In Sacramento, it's $400,000. Great for the person
So
who benefits.
How do you provide a product?
The products are out there.
Price or a third that price.
The products are out there, but we're not doing enough to push and encourage
and if we look
scale.
If we look at electric cars,
Yeah.
look at Tesla, for instance, and the incentives that were available for people to buy an electric vehicle and to use an HOV lane, those are incentives that were put in place that the market reacted to. And so I like the incentive idea. I know that you're talking that maybe it's a balance between a carrot and a stick.
It is.
Okay, but
the mandate's
think
overall production.
To the degree
incentive is for the.
Yeah. To the degree that we can provide incentives for the product that California needs, and we need to define what that product is, right? That could go a long way in terms of helping us solve our housing needs. And so you're right in the middle of it, and I appreciate your sharing us
Certainly
with
don't
us
have all the
what's going on, and what can we do, if anything, from the BOE from that incentive standpoint. But you're saying it should be targeted, and that you want proof that that it's being built before any incentive is provided.
Yeah.
And that it's achieving the goal that California wants.
Yes, and incentivize innovation. That's what, don't just incentivize more housing. That's too generic.
Yeah.
I would incentivize innovation.
I'm glad to hear that you're talking about the private sector, because in Santa Monica, I've had the opportunity to meet with for-profit developers that are now telling me if the BOE could come up with some ways where they can get some exemptions in terms of building affordable housing, you wouldn't need the money that you get from some of the cities to subsidize it, because I think that's what's so expensive.
Yes.
Especially in areas, the Bay Area, Santa Monica, where the land cost is just prohibitive sometimes to build affordable housing. And I think somehow we can, if we bring the private sector to the table with some creative measures that we can come up with that would incentivize them to invest, and then you're bringing down, because, I hear what you're saying. That's the things we're always getting criticized. You're building units, but it's costing $400,000 to build a unit. And the private sector says, we could do it for half the cost if you just give us some incentives to do it.
I think, to repeat myself, we need more innovation because, so SB 375, which I know is controversial, part of the impetus behind that is that even though everybody wants an acre and their own space, part of the impetus behind that was the recognition that with the volume and the demand out there and the climate imperative, that we shouldn't continue to incentivize that. I mean, if people can have it, that's great, but that the public transportation dollars, the public housing dollars ought to go towards greater density and for genuine conservation of our land and our resources. And you get more units at the same time.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I want to make sure that people have the opportunity, right? I really love this American dream where everybody gets an opportunity to own a home. And I don't care if it's 500 square feet or 5,000, but if you have that opportunity to get into a small home and build that equity, and then as your life improves, hopefully, you have that opportunity to move up. If it doesn't, you've got an asset that's paid off that can help you in life.
We got to
Mr. Mayor,
respect his
you
time.
have to
I think he
go.
has to go.
Your
I gotta
staff
get to
is
the
losing
city.
their mind.
Okay.
So, thank you for
I
your time.
could stay all day.
I appreciate your heart is in the right place, but I don't think you can stay all day.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Malia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Lyon, thank you.
guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Mr. Lyon, before we dismiss and get out of here, I just wanted you to know that I really appreciate your perspective, and I'm glad you're here to be a part of this conversation. You said something that was really struck me, and that was that that property tax wasn't necessarily your area of expertise, and I want to assure you that you're in a room full of people that have legal degrees, brilliant minds that occupy in this space. And this conversation is helpful in the sense that it helps inform us maybe to think. Now, I'm not purporting that I am that property tax expert, but I know a couple of them that are here. And when we look critically at what kind of policies, what kind of initiatives, what kind of programs can we begin to create and implement? Maybe it's something new, maybe it's simulating and something that's already in existence. I think you kind of touched on something that is there, and I'd like to just give you one more opportunity, if you'd like to, in kind of closing remarks, to talk a little bit about how we, this body, can continue to work with you, your organization, your member organizations, to move this conversation forward about basically stimulating affordable housing.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to close the conversation down. I think you have the bully pulpit, and you've also got a staff of experts who we would like to be able to work with you to figure out how we can use the property tax tool as a fiscal tool to offer opportunities to build housing, whether that's rental housing or for sale housing. And I think using it in a positive way, as Senator Steinberg was talking about, as a reward, is something that I think we look very positively on. We think that's a good use. Now, there also have to be consequences to jurisdictions if they don't move forward with their housing obligation. We've discussed giving the Housing and Community Development Department more authority over local governments once they've got their RENA numbers. So there's a stick and carrot approach, but I think using property tax as a fiscal tool that would incentivize jurisdictions, particularly on the below market rate housing, and using it in a way that says, okay, you've committed to doing this, you've zoned the land, you've entitled the land, now you're in construction, now we're going to reward you for doing that. I think that's a good overall approach to take. If I could, I would just like to respond to something that was asked. I think, Mr. Vasquez, you asked the question about inclusionary, and it certainly is a tool out there in many jurisdictions. But in a broader way, it really kind of points out the problems that we have in terms of the overall housing picture. Because what inclusionary does is it makes market rate units more expensive so that below market rate units can be occupied. And it just continues to focus on narrow classes of individuals, home buyers, as the solution to finance housing and social problems that we've got in this state. So I think it certainly is a tool, and used appropriately, it can be effective. But to make housing more expensive for some so that it can be more affordable for others is not a good overall housing policy from our perspective.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
I got it.
Oh, you have another question?
When you're done.
I was just going to say, I think the mayor mentioned it earlier, and I think you kind of touched on it. I think we need to be creative and start coming up with, like you mentioned, and I think the mayor was right on. Tonight, I guess he's talking about some incentives to create these little mini units. And I know some people are not real big on it, but at the end of the day, we need so much housing. I think we need to be open to all types, to try to meet the need. And I think you hit on a real good point that, some of these communities are just inundated with so many folks that are in substandard housing. And if there's some way to bring those up, but then give them a pathway where those that choose to can actually have ownership, even if it's a small unit. Because without equity, that's how you can advance yourself. You need to build equity somehow.
Well, increasing housing supply, single-family, multifamily, granny units, attached, accessible units, whatever it may be, we support all of those and have supported those in the legislature for years.
Okay,
Mr.
good.
Gaines?
Good. So I, kind of similar to what I had asked Daryl about small square footage homes, where maybe we could look at incentives that would signal to the market more production of them. And I think it's very much broader than just an exemption. I think you'd have to look at your fee basis and other pathways to build them much cheaper, so that you can get a competitive product out there that people that are aspiring to own their first home have that opportunity.
Well, it's coming, Senator Gaines. It's coming. Our members are looking at modular construction. They're looking at all different intergenerational housing. They're looking at all different models now to meet the market, which is very different today than it was even 10 years ago.
Sure.
So there's, I think the next decade in California is going to be, my own opinion, is make or break for housing, for the housing industry in California. We're going to have to get creative. We've got to come up with new ways of delivering shelter to individuals. We're also going to have to deal with the transitional issue of homelessness and those issues. So we have a lot ahead of us, but our members are looking at a variety of different housing types, situations for changing markets.
Great. Thank you for your time. Appreciate
Of course,
it.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing this to us, Member Cohen, and I think as we move forward, and I know it looks like it's going to be a hot topic moving forward, especially in some of our informational hearings, because we're hearing a lot from the community because the need is so great. And I appreciate your thoughts and ideas, and
Thank you.
we'll definitely be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, colleagues, we've actually received a lot of information on this topic this month, last month, and perhaps we should begin to think about exploring options that we could partner with the legislature, partner with the governor's office in a meaningful way, also partnering with our local elected leaders, with the private industry and nonprofit partners, so that we are part of this conversation addressing the housing crisis that's facing the state. I think what I'd like to do is I'll bring back some recommendations, if you don't mind, to the board for your consideration, based on just some of the feedback that we've heard last month as well as this month. Okay, I'll bring it back, and perhaps it'll turn into some action items. Thank you.
Thank you. With that concludes this item. Ms. Davis, what do we have next?
Our final item for the day is item N, public comment on matters not on the agenda. At this time, we have not received any public comment forms.
Chair Cohen, I reserved some comment from, as an L2 item, is that the matter's been provided in our materials. That's my brief comments. Conclusion is that we have on our radar the future of Bagley Keene, and I'd like to be heard.
I'm sorry, Member Schaefer, what item are you referring to?
It's L2, strategic plan. My pages are in the, my comments are in the material. That's part of our written material here today. I'm not providing any documents as I submitted a month ago, and you said if I'm providing, documents, the documents have to be put in a certain period of time. I think we've met that period of time, but I've been sitting here all day thinking you'd give me the time I'm spending right now of my own choice.
Okay, so Chairman Vasquez, I understand that Member Schaefer's asking for L2 to be reopened so he can make some comments on some materials that he may have submitted or information he provided in conjunction with that one. So it's up to you whether you'd like to recall L2.
I'm open. So
Okay.
with the procedural thing, do we just have to reopen L2?
Correct.
We put this matter in the parking lot a month ago when we had a meeting.
Yes, okay. So you need to call the item back?
Yes, I'll call the item
All
back.
right.
L2, Board Member Strategic Planning Session, presented by Chairman Vasquez. The item is reopened.
So now that it's reopened, go ahead and give your comments on L2. This is on the strategic plan.
Correct.
Thank you. We had a meeting with learned people on several issues, and we put some of them into the parking lot, which is a way of saying we'll get to them when we can. And all the elements of the strategic plan, which reflects our collective wisdom, require cooperation and coordination of our efforts. In order to work together, we need to be able to communicate effectively with one another. Unfortunately, the current interpretation of the Bagley-Keene Act prevents us from engaging in this necessary conversation. I think that if we are going to successfully implement our strategic plan, we must first determine to what extent Bagley-Keene permits us to even talk to one another. That's why I suggested during the strategic planning session that we would revisit this application of Bagley-Keene to our body. I've received passive acquiescence from my colleagues on the matter, but unfortunately, we moved it to the back parking lot, which is all the great wisdom we want to talk about, but we haven't had a chance to do it yet. I feel strongly that the limits of Bagley-Keene need to be reassessed. I think we all agree it's fine to discuss it among ourselves, what the weather's like, how bad the traffic is, or the marriage of mutual friends, anything. And certainly we know we are prohibited from discussing upcoming matters on the BOE agenda. We're all alert people, we're smart people, educated people, and we know the wrath of the law is out there if we stray. But, you know, even our lightheaded conversations, Christmas time, whatever we want to talk about, we tend to not want to be seen with each other. We're trying to avoid not only impropriety, but the appearance of impropriety. And if three of us are in, you know, the room, maybe that's the appearance of impropriety. What about discussing procedural and administrative issues, such as our plan? How can we implement it if neither we nor our staff can communicate about it other than in a forum such as this? I've discussed with Chair Vasquez the idea of revisiting Bagley-Keene, and he agrees that we should do so. He's asked me to look into this issue and meet with staff and other legal experts and develop some guidelines and proposals, and I've done a lot of reading. I've been reading the Attorney General's evaluation of Bagley-Keene. I've been reading the report of the Little Hoover Commission that's gone into very extensive the issues where the Bagley-Keene is being overinterpreted. The bottom line seems to me to be that the chief counsels that each of us have overinterpreted it because they figure that's the way to keep us out of lawsuits. But I think they failed to distinguish between impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. I think we can have the appearance of impropriety without, you know, triggering misconduct. I've already started this, and I discovered that Bagley-Keene was enacted only to prevent members from achieving consensus on an upcoming item before the board. It was never, ever intended to prevent all communication on anything related to the board. In summary, part of the strategic plan is to annually take a look at our governance policy. This is specifically stated in our plan priority 1B1. Our governance policy currently has a section on the Bagley-Keene Act, which is section 6A. I am ongoing in a thorough study of Bagley-Keene. I write little notes to my colleagues on things that I observe that's out there in the public domain, which I'm perfectly able to do, with an eye towards amending our governance policy to properly reflect the original intent of the Bagley-Keene so we can properly apply it to our discussions. The Board of Equalization would be much more effective if we were able to communicate more openly with one another. I fear in our haste to try to avoid any appearance of impropriety, we may be throwing the baby out with the bath. And the public will be the losers if that's the way we're going to do business. So I've taken this issue out of the parking lot. I've put it into front and center, and you'll be hearing more from me on this issue.
What if we do this? I'm thinking, you know, because I know you've spent some time on this, is if the members are in agreement, I would propose that we allow you to take lead on this and sit with staff and see what you can come up with in terms of what we can and can't do, given the guidelines and restrictions we have under the Bagley-Keene.
I found staff very easy to work with, and I will do that.
Sounds good. If everybody's okay with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Thank you, Member Shea, for taking this up.
Thank
And we'll expect a report.
Yeah, thank you, appreciate it.
With that I think concludes L2 now?
That is
Now we can go
correct.
back to, well, you said public, there is no public comment.
There were no public comment forms received, so there are no public comments for the meeting. That was the last item on the agenda.
So that's last time. So now we're prepared to adjourn.
Yes.
You know, members, I don't have a real detailed adjournment motion, but I thought it'd be appropriate to adjourn in honor of Kobe Bryant. You know, I had the opportunity to meet him years back, and, you know, he's from L.A., and I think he had not only an impact in L.A., but I think he had an impact throughout the world, as we're hearing from especially folks in the international community, as well as within the U.S., and he was, I think, such a role model, not just for the athletes, but just being a good person and a generous person. You know, he was just getting off after retiring to start developing his philanthropic agenda, and it's sad to see that his life was taken early on.
And his daughter with him, too.
And not only his daughter, and then you had several other young up-and-coming athletes that were there going to a camp specifically on basketball. And I just wanted to adjourn in his honor as well.
I second that, and thank you.
And as we close out the meeting, for those that are here still, you're welcome to join us. We have a happy birthday, Brenda Fleming, our executive director's birthday here. Well,
Thank you.
that concludes the meeting.